Long before the Phoenicians emerged as a recognizable historical force, the eastern Mediterranean coastline had already fixed the limits and possibilities of life along its shores. The Levantine coast forms a narrow corridor between the Mediterranean Sea and the steep uplands of the Lebanon and Anti-Lebanon mountain ranges. From the northern edge of modern Israel through coastal Lebanon and into southern Syria, this strip rarely exceeds 40 kilometers in width. Archaeological surveys indicate that arable land was limited, fragmented by river valleys and rocky outcrops. Inland movement was constrained, while maritime access was immediate and continuous. Records indicate that this geography encouraged early coastal orientation long before the development of large-scale seafaring networks. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, permanent urban settlements had already formed at key harbor sites. Excavations at Byblos reveal continuous occupation layers beginning in the early Bronze Age, with evidence of stone architecture, harbor installations, and imported materials. Sidon and Tyre show similar settlement patterns, though Tyre's island location offered additional natural protection. These communities did not emerge as isolated ports but as nodes within broader Near Eastern exchange systems that linked the Levant to Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. Archaeologists uncovered substantial quantities of Egyptian artifacts at Byblos, including inscribed stone vessels bearing the names of Old Kingdom pharaohs such as Khafre and Pepi I. Egyptian texts refer to Byblos as a primary source of cedar timber, a resource absent in the Nile Valley but essential for shipbuilding, monumental construction, and elite material culture. The Palermo stone and later Middle Kingdom inscriptions confirm that these exchanges were systematic and state-supported rather than sporadic trade encounters. The cedar forests of the Lebanon mountains shaped coastal economic specialization. Timber extraction required organized labor, transport infrastructure, and coordination between inland and coastal populations. River systems such as the Adonis, Nar Ibrahim, facilitated movement of logs from upland forests to coastal ports. Material evidence suggests that this logistical capacity existed centuries before the rise of a distinct Phoenician identity. Economic dependency on maritime export became structurally embedded in these communities at an early stage. During the Middle Bronze Age, fortified urban centers expanded along the coast. Defensive walls at Sidon and Byblos reflect both population growth and increasing competition among regional powers. Yet these fortifications did not signal isolation. Imported ceramics from Cyprus and the Aegean appear alongside local wares, indicating sustained connectivity. Burial assemblages demonstrate shared cultural practices with inland Canaanite populations, reinforcing that coastal societies remained integrated with the broader Levantine cultural sphere. Written sources from Mesopotamia are limited for this period, but indirect evidence supports the existence of long-distance maritime trade routes. Copper ingots, Cypriot pottery, and obsidian fragments suggest exchange networks extending across the eastern Mediterranean. The absence of centralized imperial control over the coast during much of the early and Middle Bronze Ages allowed local elites to manage trade independently while maintaining diplomatic ties with larger powers when necessary. Despite later Greek terminology, there is no evidence that these populations identified themselves as a single ethnic or political group during this era. Inscriptions from the period, where available, reflect local identities centered on individual cities rather than collective labels. Linguistically, the inhabitants spoke Northwest Semitic dialects closely related to those used throughout inland Canaan. Religious practices, burial customs, and domestic architecture show continuity across coastal and inland zones, further confirming the absence of a distinct Phoenician culture at this stage. The Late Bronze Age introduced increasing imperial involvement. Egyptian hegemony expanded northward under the 18th dynasty, bringing the Levantine coast into a system of vassalage. The Amarna letters, dating to the 14th century BCE, include correspondence from coastal rulers such as Ribhadda of Byblos. These texts reveal cities dependent on Egyptian protection yet economically indispensable due to their control of maritime trade and timber resources. Political authority remained local, but external pressure intensified. Archaeological layers from this period show continuity rather than collapse. Urban centers remained occupied, harbor facilities persisted, and trade goods continued to circulate. This stability contrasts sharply with the disruptions that affected inland regions more severely. Coastal resilience during periods of regional stress suggests that maritime access provided both economic flexibility and strategic insulation. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, the Levantine coast had developed a long-established pattern of urban life oriented toward the sea, supported by trade, resource extraction, and diplomatic pragmatism. These cities had not yet become the seafaring powers known from later centuries, but the structural foundations were already in place. Geography, resource distribution, and early exchange networks combined to produce coastal societies whose survival and prosperity depended on maritime connectivity. As regional trade intensified and imperial systems fluctuated in strength, these port cities increasingly differentiated themselves from inland centers, setting the conditions for political and economic transformations that would follow in the centuries ahead. Before continuing, viewers who wish to follow future long-form historical documentaries may subscribe to the channel and enable notifications for regular Nightfall releases. Engagement through comments also helps guide future topics and areas of focus. When imperial archives fell silent across the eastern Mediterranean, activity did not cease everywhere. Along the Levantine coast, continuity proved more durable than collapse. By the late 13th century BCE, the political order that had governed the eastern Mediterranean for centuries began to disintegrate. The Hittite Empire collapsed entirely, with its capital at Hattusa abandoned. Egyptian authority in the Levant weakened rapidly following the reign of Ramesses III, as military garrisons were withdrawn and tribute networks dissolved. Mycenaean palace systems in the Aegean ceased to function, severing long-distance trade routes that had connected Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, and Greece. Contemporary texts and archaeological layers confirm that this was not a single event but a systemic breakdown affecting multiple interconnected powers. Inland regions of the Levant experienced pronounced disruption. Major urban centers declined or were abandoned, as evidenced by destruction layers and reduced material output at sites such as Hazor and Megiddo. Agricultural production suffered from population displacement and the collapse of centralized administration. By contrast, coastal cities such as Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre show remarkable continuity through this period. Excavation data reveal uninterrupted occupation layers, maintained harbor infrastructure, and sustained craft production, suggesting that these cities were insulated from the worst effects of imperial collapse. Egyptian sources from the late New Kingdom provide indirect confirmation of this retreat. Inscriptions documenting the campaigns of Ramesses III against the so-called Sea Peoples indicate a defensive posture rather than sustained control in Asia. After the early 12th century BCE, Egyptian administrative texts referencing direct governance in the northern Levant become scarce. Records indicate that Egypt no longer maintained effective oversight of coastal city-states, ending centuries of imperial supervision that had shaped regional politics. The withdrawal of imperial authority altered the balance of power rather than eliminating it. Coastal polities were no longer required to supply tribute on imperial schedules or host foreign officials. Instead, local elites assumed greater control over economic and diplomatic decision-making. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of administrative continuity at coastal sites, including seals, storage facilities, and standardized weights, suggesting that local governance structures adapted rather than collapsed. This administrative resilience distinguished the coast from inland territories that had depended more directly on imperial systems. Trade networks contracted but did not disappear. While large-scale palace-sponsored exchange declined, smaller, flexible maritime routes remained viable. Ceramic assemblages from coastal sites show reduced diversity but continued importation from Cyprus and limited Aegean contacts. This indicates that seaborne exchange could function without imperial coordination. The sea provided alternative pathways at a time when overland routes were increasingly unstable due to political fragmentation and insecurity. This period also marked a shift in military dynamics. Imperial armies had previously enforced order across the Levant. Their absence reduced large-scale conflict but increased local autonomy. There is little archaeological evidence for widespread warfare among coastal cities during the immediate post-collapse period. Instead, fortifications were maintained rather than expanded, suggesting a focus on stability and protection rather than territorial conquest. This environment favored commercial survival over military expansion. Written records from this transitional era are limited, but later Assyrian sources retrospectively describe Levantine coastal cities as long-established, prosperous, and politically distinct by the early 1st millennium BCE. This implies that their consolidation occurred during the centuries following the Late Bronze Age collapse. Linguistic continuity in inscriptions and material culture indicates that populations did not undergo abrupt ethnic change. Northwest Semitic language forms persisted, and religious practices retained Canaanite foundations. The absence of centralized imperial power created conditions in which maritime communities could reorganize their priorities. Without imperial demand dictating production, coastal economies adjusted toward regional and interregional trade, controlled by local elites. This shift did not require technological revolution. Ships, navigation methods, and harbor facilities had existed for centuries. What changed was the political context in which they operated. Opportunity emerged from structural vacancy rather than innovation. By the end of the 12th century BCE, the Levantine coast had entered a new phase of development. Cities remained independent, economically active, and culturally continuous, yet no longer subordinate to distant empires. This transitional stability laid the groundwork for the expansion that would follow, as coastal polities refined maritime networks and political institutions suited to a decentralized Mediterranean world. With imperial power withdrawn and inland systems weakened, these port cities moved toward a phase of autonomous development that would soon distinguish them from their regional predecessors and set the stage for their emergence as dominant maritime actors. The people later known as the Phoenicians did not call themselves by that name, nor did they initially conceive of themselves as a single people. The term Phoenician originates from Greek authors writing centuries after the period in question. Greek sources, including Homer and later historians such as Herodotus, use the word phoinix, commonly associated with the purple dye produced along the Levantine coast. Linguistically, the term reflects an external classification based on economic specialization rather than ethnic self-identification. No contemporary inscriptions from the Late Bronze or Early Iron Age indicate that the inhabitants of the Levantine coast used a collective name equivalent to Phoenician. Archaeological and textual evidence instead points to strong local identities centered on individual cities. Inscriptions, seal impressions, and later royal dedicatory texts identify rulers and elites as King of Tyre, King of Sidon, or King of Byblos. Political authority was city-based, and loyalty was tied to urban institutions rather than broader ethnic constructs. This pattern reflects continuity from earlier Canaanite city-state traditions, rather than the emergence of a new political or ethnic entity. Linguistically, the coastal populations spoke Northwest Semitic dialects closely related to those of inland Canaan. Comparative analysis of inscriptions from the early 1st millennium BCE shows substantial continuity in vocabulary, grammar, and script development. The so-called Phoenician language is best understood as a regional evolution of Late Bronze Age Canaanite rather than a distinct linguistic rupture. Records indicate gradual standardization in writing conventions rather than sudden innovation. Religious practices further demonstrate continuity. Deities such as El, Baal, Astarte, and Anat were already prominent in the Late Bronze Age pantheon and continued to be worshipped with localized variations. Archaeologists uncovered temple foundations and cultic installations at coastal sites that show uninterrupted use across the transition from the Late Bronze to Iron Age. While divine epithets and ritual emphasis evolved, the underlying religious framework remained consistent with earlier Levantine traditions. Urban governance during this period also reflects gradual transformation rather than replacement. Following the withdrawal of imperial oversight, city elites consolidated authority within existing administrative structures. Kingship persisted, but evidence suggests power was increasingly balanced by councils of prominent families involved in trade and production. This hybrid political model allowed cities to maintain stability while adapting to new economic realities shaped by maritime exchange. By the 11th century BCE, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos had emerged as fully autonomous city-states. Archaeological layers from this period show urban expansion, renewed construction activity, and increased standardization in weights, measures, and administrative tools. These developments indicate growing economic coordination and institutional maturity rather than externally imposed change. Each city pursued its own interests while remaining culturally connected through language, religion, and shared commercial practices. The emergence of what modern scholars identify as Phoenician culture thus reflects a process of regional differentiation within the broader Canaanite world. External observers, particularly Greeks, perceived these coastal cities as a coherent group because of their shared maritime orientation and specialized industries. Internally, however, identity remained local and civic, structured around city institutions rather than ethnic unity. This distinction between external classification and internal self-identification is critical for understanding Phoenician expansion. The absence of a centralized ethnic or political identity did not hinder cooperation. Instead, shared practices and mutual economic interests facilitated collaboration across distances without requiring formal unification. This flexibility became a defining characteristic of Phoenician activity in the Mediterranean. By approximately 1000 BCE, the Levantine coastal cities had completed the transition from late Bronze Age dependencies to independent maritime polities. Their identities were rooted in urban continuity, linguistic persistence, and adaptive governance rather than conquest or migration. These conditions formed the cultural and institutional foundation upon which later political and economic systems would be built. As the city-states moved toward more formalized structures of power and exchange in the centuries that followed, Phoenician kings ruled cities, but commerce ruled Phoenicia. By the early 1st millennium BCE, the principal Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, had developed political systems that balanced hereditary monarchy with the authority of powerful urban elites. Unlike the territorial monarchies of Mesopotamia or Egypt, Phoenician kingship operated within a narrowly defined civic framework. Royal authority was real and visible, but it was neither absolute nor detached from the economic interests of the city. Governance reflected the priorities of maritime trade, diplomatic negotiation, and religious legitimacy rather than military conquest or centralized administration. Epigraphic evidence provides the clearest insight into this political structure. Royal inscriptions from Byblos, including those of kings such as Ahiram and Yeamilk, c. 10th century BCE, present the king as a builder of temples and a recipient of divine favor. These texts emphasize piety and civic benefaction rather than coercive power. The Ahiram sarcophagus inscription, among the earliest substantial Phoenician texts, identifies the king through lineage and divine sanction but offers no indication of territorial rule beyond the city itself. Records indicate that royal authority was anchored in tradition, ritual, and urban continuity. In Tyre and Sidon, later Assyrian records corroborate this model. Kings such as Hiram I of Tyre, known from both biblical references and Assyrian annals, appear primarily as diplomatic actors. Hiram's correspondence with Solomon of Israel, described in the Hebrew Bible, centers on commercial exchange, timber, craftsmen, and shipping, rather than military alliance. Assyrian tribute lists likewise depict Phoenician kings as negotiators who preserved autonomy through payment and diplomacy, not force of arms. This pattern suggests that kings functioned as intermediaries between their cities and external powers. Alongside kingship, oligarchic elements played a central role in governance. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates the presence of councils composed of elite families engaged in trade, ship ownership, and craft production. Although direct records of council proceedings do not survive, references in later Greek sources and indirect indicators such as standardized weights and seals imply collective decision-making structures. These councils constrained royal authority, particularly in matters affecting commerce, taxation, and foreign relations. The economic basis of this oligarchic influence was maritime trade. Merchant families controlled ships, warehouses, and overseas contacts, giving them leverage within the political system. Kings depended on these elites to generate revenue, supply tribute to imperial powers, and maintain urban prosperity. This interdependence produced a political equilibrium in which royal authority was preserved, but policy reflected commercial priorities. Governance favored stability, predictable administration, and the protection of trade networks. Religion reinforced this political balance. Kings served as chief religious patrons, responsible for temple construction, offerings, and the maintenance of cults dedicated to city deities such as Melkart in Tyre or Eshmun in Sidon. Inscriptions consistently link kingship to divine favor, suggesting that religious legitimacy compensated for the absence of large standing armies or territorial control. Temples themselves functioned as economic centers, housing treasuries and facilitating contracts, further intertwining political, religious, and commercial authority. This system differed markedly from contemporary Near Eastern states. In Assyria, kingship was militarized and expansionist. In Egypt, it was sacral and centralized. Phoenician cities lacked both the geographic capacity and the political incentive for territorial empire building. Their narrow coastal territory and dependence on overseas exchange favored a governance model that prioritized negotiation over domination. Political power was thus inward-facing, focused on managing urban affairs and external relationships rather than administering hinterlands. Archaeological layers from Phoenician cities support this interpretation. Urban continuity, limited palace complexes, and the absence of monumental royal architecture comparable to Mesopotamian capitals suggest restrained royal display. Investment was directed toward harbors, workshops, and religious structures rather than palaces or fortifications. This pattern reflects collective urban priorities rather than personal aggrandizement by rulers. Over time, this hybrid system proved resilient. The balance between monarchy and oligarchy allowed Phoenician cities to adapt to shifting geopolitical conditions without internal collapse. Kings could be replaced without dismantling institutions, and councils could adjust commercial strategies in response to changing markets. This flexibility explains how Phoenician cities retained autonomy for centuries despite pressure from larger imperial powers. By the beginning of the 9th century BCE, Phoenician kingship had become a stable civic institution embedded within an oligarchic commercial framework. Authority was localized, negotiated, and constrained, enabling cities to function efficiently as independent political units. This political autonomy, grounded in economic interdependence rather than territorial control, created conditions in which individual cities could pursue specialized economic strategies while remaining diplomatically agile. As a result, political organization in Phoenician cities did not aim at unification or empire. Instead, it reinforced urban independence and commercial adaptability, allowing each city-state to develop according to its geographic position, resources, and trade connections as Phoenician activity across the Mediterranean intensified. Phoenicia was a network, not a nation. During the first millennium BCE, the principal Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, exhibited a pattern of decentralized power, maintaining independence while engaging in both competition and collaboration. Tyre's emergence as a dominant maritime center did not eliminate the political or economic significance of Sidon or Byblos. Archaeological evidence, including contemporary inscriptions and urban infrastructure, confirms that each city continued to operate autonomously, managing its own administration, religious institutions, and trade networks. This decentralized structure fostered a system in which rivalry coexisted with cooperative practices. Competition between cities served as a catalyst for innovation, particularly in maritime technology and commercial strategy. Tyre's development of robust shipbuilding facilities, evidenced by harbor constructions and imported timber usage, coincided with increased sophistication in navigational techniques and hull design. Sidon and Byblos responded by enhancing their own port facilities, standardizing cargo measurements, and diversifying traded commodities. The circulation of weights, seals, and amphora stamps across cities indicates that these competitive pressures promoted uniformity in commercial standards while maintaining distinct urban identities. Cooperation, however, remained a central feature of intercity relations. Shared language, religious traditions, and cultural practices facilitated communication and reduced friction. Northwest Semitic dialects were mutually intelligible across city boundaries, supporting trade agreements, diplomatic correspondence, and maritime contracts. Temples dedicated to common deities, such as Melkart and Astarte, served as focal points for intercity interaction, including coordinated religious festivals and economic exchanges. Archaeologists have uncovered artifacts and votive inscriptions suggesting that religious observances reinforced commercial alliances, providing a mechanism for trust among otherwise autonomous polities. Political correspondence, as recorded in later Assyrian annals and fragmentary local inscriptions, shows that cities occasionally coordinated responses to external pressures. Tribute arrangements with larger empires were sometimes negotiated collectively, allowing coastal states to maintain favorable terms with Egypt, Assyria, or later Babylon. Despite this coordination, no evidence exists for overarching political authority among the cities themselves. Treaties and agreements were pragmatic and issue-specific rather than institutionalized into a permanent federation. Rivalry and cooperation combined to shape urban priorities without provoking large-scale conflict. Fortifications at Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were maintained primarily to protect commercial assets rather than to assert territorial dominance over neighboring cities. Archaeological surveys reveal limited evidence of destructive warfare between the major coastal centers during this period. This pattern contrasts sharply with contemporaneous regional states, such as the militarized kingdoms of Mesopotamia, suggesting that economic interdependence acted as a stabilizing factor. The decentralized network also influenced social and political structures within each city. Elites who controlled trade, shipbuilding, and diplomatic negotiations could assert influence over civic policy, while kings retained ceremonial and religious authority. This division of power minimized the potential for autocratic overreach and allowed cities to adapt independently to market fluctuations, environmental pressures, and shifting regional alliances. In practical terms, each city-state operated as a semi-autonomous node within a broader Mediterranean commercial network. Maritime expansion was directly shaped by these intercity dynamics. Competition for trade routes and access to resources drove exploratory voyages and the establishment of overseas settlements. Tyre's dominance in long-distance shipping encouraged Sidon and Byblos to seek complementary markets rather than confront Tyre militarily. Archaeological evidence from Phoenician outposts in Cyprus, Sardinia, and the Levantine periphery indicates that each city extended influence through colonization and trade rather than conquest. These settlements functioned as extensions of the network, reinforcing economic and cultural cohesion while preserving city autonomy. This balance between rivalry and collaboration also affected technological and administrative innovation. Standardized amphora shapes, seal inscriptions, and weights facilitated exchange across the network, enabling each city to operate efficiently without centralized control. Knowledge of navigation, ship design, and commodity management circulated widely, demonstrating that cooperative mechanisms could exist alongside competitive incentives. Inscriptions referencing merchant partnerships and cargo agreements provide material evidence of these practices. By maintaining autonomy while leveraging shared language, religious customs, and trade protocols, Phoenician cities created a resilient urban network. Competition encouraged growth and innovation, while cooperation reduced conflict and strengthened collective economic and cultural presence in the Mediterranean. Unlike large territorial empires, Phoenicia thrived as a series of independent nodes whose influence extended far beyond the narrow coastal corridor. The decentralized structure allowed cities to specialize economically according to geographic position, resource availability, and maritime connections. As a result, each city could pursue distinct commercial strategies while contributing to the broader coherence of the Phoenician network. This system of rivalrous collaboration laid the groundwork for the expansion of Phoenician influence across the Mediterranean, establishing trading posts, colonies, and strategic alliances that would define the civilization's next phase of development. Tribute became a tool of survival. During the first millennium BCE, Phoenician city-states operated under the shadow of larger imperial powers, most notably Egypt and Assyria. Rather than being annexed or directly occupied, these cities engaged in pragmatic diplomacy that allowed them to maintain autonomy while satisfying imperial demands. Evidence from both archaeological sources and contemporary texts indicates that Phoenician rulers negotiated tribute payments in silver, timber, luxury goods, and shipbuilding services, rather than providing manpower for military campaigns. This approach enabled the cities to remain politically independent while avoiding destructive conflict. Egyptian authority in the northern Levant during the Late Bronze Age had already weakened, but intermittent campaigns and trade influence persisted into the early 1st millennium BCE. The Amarna letters and later Egyptian texts record that coastal cities like Byblos paid tribute in cedar timber and other commodities to secure favor and protection. These payments were formalized and ritualized, establishing a precedent for later tributary arrangements with emergent empires such as Assyria. Archaeological evidence, including harbor improvements and storage facilities at Byblos and Tyre, reflects investments aligned with fulfilling tribute obligations and facilitating maritime commerce. Assyrian records from the 9th through 7th centuries BCE provide detailed accounts of interactions with Phoenician polities. Inscriptions of kings such as Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib describe cities including Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos as tributaries rather than conquered provinces. Payments were collected in silver, precious metals, and goods essential for Assyrian court rituals or military logistics. Notably, the records emphasize submission and compliance without describing the stationing of large garrisons or administrative takeover, underscoring the independence maintained by the coastal rulers. This tributary system functioned as a diplomatic balancing act. By contributing wealth rather than troops, Phoenician cities avoided involvement in extensive imperial campaigns that could destabilize their internal political structures. Royal inscriptions indicate that kings personally oversaw these arrangements, using them to assert legitimacy while protecting civic interests. Councils of merchant elites facilitated logistical arrangements, ensuring that tribute payments did not compromise trade operations or economic stability. In effect, the tribute system acted as both a political safeguard and an instrument for sustaining prosperity. The arrangement also shaped Phoenician economic priorities. Ports and harbors were maintained to high standards, shipbuilding remained sophisticated, and craft production continued at scale. Archaeologists have uncovered standardized weights, storage jars, and shipping manifests from this period, demonstrating that tribute obligations coincided with the expansion of commercial infrastructure. Rather than limiting economic activity, tributary relationships reinforced the importance of maritime networks and incentivized efficiency in trade operations. Religious and ceremonial practices complemented the political and economic dimensions of tribute. Inscriptions often record offerings made to local deities in conjunction with the delivery of goods to imperial powers. Temples functioned as centers for both administration and economic coordination, supporting storage, redistribution, and record-keeping. By integrating civic, religious, and commercial responsibilities, the cities maintained internal cohesion even as they navigated complex external obligations. Phoenician diplomacy was marked by adaptability. In times of imperial weakness, cities leveraged their maritime connections to expand trade, establish colonies, or adjust tribute arrangements. When Assyrian or Egyptian influence strengthened, tribute payments were negotiated to prevent military reprisals. This flexibility minimized the risk of violent intervention while preserving strategic autonomy, allowing the cities to remain economically active and politically independent over multiple generations. The tributary model also contributed to long-term resilience. Archaeological continuity in urban centers, coupled with ongoing harbor construction and expansion of trade networks, indicates that Phoenician polities maintained stability despite fluctuating imperial pressures. Unlike inland territories more directly controlled by empires, the coastal cities could capitalize on maritime mobility to respond to shifting political landscapes, sustaining both economic growth and civic governance. By the end of the 8th century BCE, Phoenician city-states had institutionalized tributary diplomacy as a core element of political strategy. Their cities remained autonomous, economically vigorous, and diplomatically skilled, demonstrating that survival under imperial hegemony could be achieved without territorial conquest. Tribute, in this context, functioned not as subjugation but as a mechanism to balance power, protect civic interests, and maintain access to international trade networks. Economic strength increasingly depended on maritime reach. The ability to move goods, maintain harbors, and project influence across the Mediterranean became the foundation for Phoenician prosperity. This integration of tribute, commerce, and diplomacy would shape the next stage of Phoenician expansion, allowing city-states to extend their networks and influence far beyond the narrow Levantine coastline. Their ships were their borders. Phoenician maritime capacity was the foundation of their economic and political influence. Archaeological evidence, iconographic depictions, and textual sources indicate that coastal cities developed advanced shipbuilding techniques suited for both Mediterranean trade and extended voyages. Central to these innovations was the use of the keel, which provided structural stability for open-sea navigation and allowed for larger cargo loads than earlier hull designs. Ships were constructed with mortise and tenon joints, ensuring rigidity while permitting flexibility in rough waters. These design features were evident in representations on carved ivories, stele, and Egyptian reliefs depicting Levantine vessels, as well as in shipwreck remains discovered off the coasts of the central Mediterranean. Phoenician vessels were typically equipped as biremes or, in some cases, larger multi-banked configurations, combining oared propulsion with square sails. The integration of oars and sails allowed for maneuverability in coastal waters and endurance in open sea conditions. Iconography from Tyre and Sidon shows ships with raised stern castles, forecastles, and reinforced hulls, reflecting attention to both cargo security and crew operation. Wrecks such as the Kyrenia ship off Cyprus provide direct evidence of these construction methods, confirming textual accounts that indicate ships of 30 to 40 tons capacity were in operation as early as the 9th century BCE. Navigation techniques complemented technological innovations. Phoenician sailors relied on a combination of coastal piloting and celestial observation. Coastal landmarks, river mouths, and promontories provided orientation along familiar routes, while stars and lunar cycles were used for open-sea voyages. References in later Greek sources, corroborated by Mediterranean maritime archaeology, suggest that the North Star and constellations such as Orion provided consistent points of reference, allowing for precise navigation across hundreds of nautical miles. The combination of empirical observation and practical knowledge supported long-distance trade with minimal risk of shipwreck or loss of cargo. Economic implications of these innovations were significant. Larger hull capacity enabled the transport of bulk commodities such as timber, metal ingots, wine, and olive oil. Standardized amphory and storage techniques, evidenced by both excavated cargo and inscriptions, facilitated systematic packing and accounting, supporting large-scale exchange across multiple Mediterranean ports. Ship design also allowed for rapid deployment of skilled personnel and craftsmen, enabling cities to maintain flexible trade operations while minimizing overhead and exposure to maritime hazards. The organizational structure of Phoenician maritime operations reflected the demands of these technical capabilities. Merchant families often financed ship construction, while crews were drawn from specialized labor networks encompassing rowers, sailors, and navigators. Epigraphic sources, including votive inscriptions and harbor records, suggest that ship ownership could be collective, with multiple stakeholders sharing both risk and profit. This system reinforced urban oligarchies and connected political authority to maritime success, as kings and councils oversaw resource allocation for construction, repair, and deployment. Evidence indicates that Phoenician shipbuilding adapted to regional conditions across the Mediterranean. Hull forms and rigging varied depending on the intended route, with lighter, shallow draft vessels suited for coastal transport and sturdier, deep keel ships used for longer voyages to Cyprus, Sardinia, or North Africa. Archaeological surveys of harbor sites show slipways, storage sheds, and timber stockpiles strategically located to support ongoing construction, maintenance, and seasonal readiness. These infrastructures enabled cities to maintain continuity in commercial activity despite the unpredictability of political and environmental conditions. Technological standardization enhanced interoperability across the network of city-states. Uniform construction techniques, sailing methods, and cargo systems allowed ships from Tyre, Sidon, or Byblos to operate interchangeably along overlapping trade routes. This facilitated both competition and collaboration, enabling merchant networks to respond rapidly to shifts in market demand or political influence. Standardized practices also simplified training and recruitment, as knowledge could be transmitted reliably between generations without reliance on centralized education systems. Finally, Phoenician shipbuilding had strategic significance beyond commerce. The design and capacity of vessels allowed for rapid movement of tribute, diplomatic envoys, and elite personnel, ensuring cities could meet obligations to Egypt, Assyria, or other powers without exposing internal populations to military risk. Shipwrights and navigators thus became critical actors in maintaining political stability, and investment in maritime infrastructure functioned as a form of civic insurance against both environmental and geopolitical hazards. By the early 1st millennium BCE, Phoenician ship technology had established a durable maritime advantage. Keel-based construction, multipurpose propulsion, celestial navigation, and standardized cargo practices collectively enabled cities to dominate trade, extend influence, and secure economic resilience. This foundation of maritime capacity directly enabled the subsequent expansion of Phoenician commercial networks, setting the stage for their enduring presence across the Mediterranean. A color became an economy. Phoenician trade was built upon a combination of natural resources, specialized production, and strategic distribution networks that extended across the Mediterranean. Among the most distinctive commodities was the purple dye extracted from the murex shell, a product whose high value shaped both economic and cultural influence. Archaeological evidence from Tyre, Sidon, and Sarepta confirms large-scale dye production facilities, including shell heaps, vats, and associated workshops. The purple dye, often associated with elite status in Egypt, Greece, and the Near East, became synonymous with wealth and prestige, creating demand that underwrote broader commercial activity. Timber from the Lebanon mountains formed another critical component of the Phoenician economy. Egyptian texts and inscriptions consistently note the export of cedar, valued for shipbuilding, temple construction, and luxury architecture. Archaeological surveys of harbors demonstrate storage and loading systems specifically designed to handle large timbers, indicating systematic extraction, transport, and maritime shipment. The combination of ship capacity and access to abundant forests enabled Phoenician cities to dominate a strategic commodity that was scarce elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Metalwork and artisanal production further diversified Phoenician trade. Excavated workshops reveal production of bronze, gold, silver, and iron goods, including tools, ceremonial items, and ornaments. Standardization in weights and measures, confirmed through amphorae, ingots, and scale artifacts, facilitated exchange across distant markets. Items were often transported in pre-measured lots, demonstrating that Phoenician commerce relied on careful organization and record-keeping rather than ad hoc transactions. Glass production was another specialized industry. Archaeologists identified furnaces and raw material residues at coastal sites, suggesting that both finished and semi-finished glassware was exported widely. These products were highly valued in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean, providing both revenue and cultural influence. The presence of Phoenician glass in foreign contexts illustrates not only the geographic reach of trade networks, but also the technical proficiency of workshops and the capacity for sustained production over generations. Trade was organized through structured exchange systems linking city-states to local, regional, and trans-Mediterranean markets. Phoenician ports functioned as hubs for redistribution, coordinating the flow of goods from inland sources to overseas destinations. Archaeological evidence shows that warehouses, amphorae storage, and quay installations were designed to optimize throughput, enabling cities to manage both volume and variety efficiently. Seal impressions, weights, and inscriptions demonstrate administrative oversight by both merchant elites and city councils, ensuring accountability and continuity in complex transactions. The role of luxury goods extended beyond commerce into diplomacy and soft power. Items such as purple-dyed textiles, finely crafted metalwork, and high-quality glass were often used as tribute, gifts, or political tokens. Egyptian and Assyrian texts document the exchange of such commodities in the context of alliance building and diplomatic negotiation. This interplay between commercial and political exchange illustrates that trade was not purely economic. It was embedded in a wider system of influence and negotiation. Phoenician merchants developed standardized practices to facilitate distant exchange. Packaging methods, including amphorae of uniform size and seal-marked cargo, allowed for reliable accounting and verification across ports. Networks of agents and resident traders ensured local adaptation, providing intelligence on markets, commodities, and competitive conditions. Inscriptions from Cyprus, Sardinia, and other Mediterranean sites record the presence of Phoenician merchants, confirming that exchange relied on both permanent infrastructure and mobile, skilled personnel. The economic centrality of maritime trade encouraged specialization among city-states. Tyre concentrated on shipbuilding and dye production, Sidon emphasized metalwork and glass, and Byblos maintained timber export and craft industries. This division of labor optimized resources and reinforced intercity interdependence, producing a robust network in which competition and cooperation were balanced. Archaeological evidence shows that each city maintained its own administrative systems for controlling production, taxation, and distribution, highlighting the sophistication of economic governance. By the early 1st millennium BCE, Phoenician trade networks were highly integrated and resilient. The combination of high-value commodities, standardized exchange practices, and skilled merchant organization enabled cities to dominate maritime commerce across the eastern and central Mediterranean. The economic significance of purple dye, in particular, illustrates how a single product could catalyze widespread urban, technological, and political development. Trade required permanent overseas footholds, setting the stage for the next phase of Phoenician expansion, in which colonies and outposts extended the reach of commerce while reinforcing the independence and resilience of city-states along the Levantine coast. The Mediterranean became a connected system. By the 1st millennium BCE, Phoenician maritime activity had transformed the eastern Mediterranean into an interconnected network of trade and exchange. Archaeological, textual, and epigraphic evidence demonstrates that Phoenician ships routinely navigated routes linking the Levantine coast to Cyprus, the Aegean, North Africa, and the western Mediterranean, including Iberia. Unlike empires that relied on political conquest, Phoenician influence was structured around commerce, communication, and the establishment of logistical hubs that facilitated long-distance movement of goods, people, and information. Routes to Cyprus were among the earliest and most intensively used. Excavations at Kition and Salamis reveal abundant Phoenician ceramics, metalwork, and inscriptions, confirming persistent trade and settlement. The island served both as a source of copper and as a transshipment point for goods moving between the Levant and the Aegean. Navigational knowledge, informed by coastal landmarks, seasonal winds, and celestial observation, allowed ships to cross the relatively short but open sea distance safely. Material remains indicate that multiple generations of Phoenician merchants and crews operated along these routes, establishing enduring logistical practices. Further west, North Africa became a significant node in the network. Phoenician settlements at sites such as Carthage, later established in the 9th century BCE, originated as trade outposts linking maritime commodities to inland markets. Archaeologists have documented Phoenician amphorae, metal objects, and luxury goods at coastal settlements from Tunisia to modern Libya, illustrating sustained economic engagement. These ports functioned as redistribution centers rather than administrative capitals, enabling local populations to participate in broader trade without direct imposition of Phoenician governance. Iberia and the western Mediterranean also entered the network through maritime outreach. Excavations in southern Spain, including Gator, modern Cadiz, show Phoenician presence dating from the late 9th century BCE. The movement of tin, silver, and other metals along these routes demonstrates that cities such as Tyre and Sidon were capable of coordinating complex supply chains over vast distances. Standardized amphorae, weights, and seal impressions indicate that these trade practices maintained consistency across regions, supporting efficient exchange and accountability. Phoenician navigation extended beyond direct trade to the facilitation of cultural transmission. Artifacts, inscriptions, and shared technological knowledge, including writing systems, shipbuilding techniques, and religious motifs, spread along these routes. Inscriptions from Cyprus, Sardinia, and Iberia reveal the use of Phoenician scripts, while artifacts in material culture, such as ceremonial objects and pottery, exhibit Levantine stylistic features. These exchanges occurred without centralized political control, highlighting the ability of commerce to transmit ideas and practices across societies without coercive oversight. Coastal settlements operated as semi-autonomous nodes within this network, balancing local governance with international connectivity. Harbor infrastructure, warehouses, and slipways facilitated not only cargo movement but also the integration of foreign knowledge and goods into local economies. This organizational model allowed cities to respond flexibly to market fluctuations, environmental conditions, or imperial pressures, reinforcing resilience and continuity over centuries. Merchant networks were critical to the operation of Mediterranean routes. Elite families invested in fleets, recruited crews, and managed long-distance trade contracts. Epigraphic evidence from Cyprus, Sardinia, and North Africa documents merchant partnerships, cargo consignments, and contractual arrangements that regulated ownership, liability, and profit distribution. These practices ensured accountability and mitigated risk in an era when voyages could extend over weeks or months, often into unfamiliar waters. The Phoenician approach to trade emphasized collaboration alongside competition. While cities maintained distinct spheres of influence, overlapping routes encouraged shared standards, mutual intelligence, and negotiated access to resources. Standardized weights, amphory types, and cargo seals facilitated interactions between Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and outposts across the Mediterranean. This coordination supported both economic efficiency and cultural cohesion, reinforcing the perception of a connected maritime system even in the absence of political unification. Seasonal and environmental factors shaped the flow of trade. Prevailing winds, currents, and storm patterns dictated the timing of departures, while coastal pilots and knowledge of safe anchorages mitigated maritime hazards. Archaeological evidence of sheltered harbors, slipways, and storage facilities confirms that Phoenicians invested in infrastructure to manage the risks of long-distance navigation. These innovations allowed trade to expand systematically rather than episodically, creating predictable networks linking the Levant to the Western Mediterranean. By the early 1st millennium BCE, Phoenician maritime routes had established a durable framework for economic, cultural, and technological exchange. The Levantine coast, through its cities and merchants, functioned as a hub in a network that stretched from Cyprus to Iberia and North Africa. These routes connected markets, facilitated knowledge transfer, and enabled sustained interaction across diverse societies. Trade expansion along these routes naturally led to the establishment of permanent overseas footholds. Colonies and outposts emerged to secure supply chains, extend influence, and manage regional logistics, marking the next phase of Phoenician expansion and laying the foundation for their broader Mediterranean presence. Phoenician colonies were ports, not provinces. By the early 1st millennium BCE, Phoenician cities had developed maritime networks capable of sustaining long-distance trade. Yet commercial opportunity alone did not fully explain the systematic establishment of overseas settlements. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that colonization was primarily motivated by the need to secure access to resources, establish safe harbor points, and maintain continuity in trade across the Mediterranean. Unlike territorial empires, Phoenician expansion emphasized strategic nodes rather than conquest, creating a network of semi-autonomous outposts that functioned as logistical and economic extensions of their home cities. Resource acquisition was a principal driver. Cyprus, Sardinia, and parts of southern Iberia were targeted for metals including copper, tin, silver, and iron, while North African coasts offered agricultural and artisanal products. Excavations at sites such as Sidon in Cyprus and Gader in Iberia reveal material culture consistent with Phoenician origin, including ceramics, amphory, and inscribed artifacts, alongside evidence of local production adapted to regional conditions. This combination of imported expertise and local resources allowed colonies to function efficiently without displacing indigenous populations, indicating a pattern of coexistence and mutual economic benefit rather than violent annexation. Trade security also shaped the selection and placement of colonies. Long maritime routes required predictable harbor sites, provisioning stations, and emergency shelters to mitigate the hazards of open sea navigation. Archaeological surveys of coastal North Africa and the Western Mediterranean identify settlements strategically located near safe anchorages and natural inlets, often in proximity to mineral or timber resources. These ports provided secure nodes for the storage, transshipment, and redistribution of goods, ensuring that commercial networks remained operational even under adverse conditions or fluctuating regional politics. Colonial planning reflected the logistical sophistication of Phoenician cities. Excavations at early colonies such as Motia in Sicily and Utica in Tunisia demonstrate organized urban layouts including harbor infrastructure, storage facilities, workshops, and residential zones. Standardized amphorae, weights, and ceilings suggest that metropolitan cities maintained oversight of production and exchange, coordinating supply chains while allowing colonies operational autonomy. Inscriptions indicate that local governance was managed by resident elites, often drawn from merchant families, under the symbolic authority of the founding city, preserving civic continuity while respecting regional conditions. Cultural continuity accompanied material and economic systems. Temples dedicated to Melkart, Astarte, and Eshmun appear in colonies contemporaneously with local religious practices. Artifacts, iconography, and inscriptions show that these sanctuaries functioned as focal points for both civic and commercial life, reinforcing social cohesion and facilitating diplomatic relations with neighboring populations. Religious and administrative structures allowed Phoenician settlers to maintain a shared identity without imposing political domination, supporting the cooperative model observed throughout the Mediterranean network. Demographic evidence indicates that Phoenician colonization was typically moderate in scale. Human remains, settlement density, and household artifacts suggest that colonial populations were primarily merchant families, skilled artisans, and their immediate networks rather than large-scale migrations. This limited demographic footprint minimized conflict with indigenous communities, while allowing the colony to manage trade and resource extraction effectively. Archaeologists note continuity in local pottery and material culture alongside Phoenician imports, confirming coexistence rather than wholesale replacement of existing populations. Economic integration reinforced the rationale for colonies. Phoenician settlements acted as intermediaries between resource zones, metropolitan cities, and other colonies, enabling complex supply chains to function across vast distances. The presence of standardized trade artifacts, warehouse facilities, and docks indicates deliberate coordination designed to maximize throughput and minimize risk. Colonies often specialized according to local resources. Cyprus for copper, Sardinia for metals, North Africa for agricultural goods, and Iberia for tin and silver. This specialization optimized trade efficiency across the network and reinforced interdependence among metropolitan cities. Political considerations were pragmatic. Colonies were not designed to administer large territories or extract tribute, but to protect trade interests and secure access to markets. Historical accounts, such as those preserved in later Greek sources, describe Phoenician outposts as commercially focused rather than militarily aggressive. Where conflicts arose with local populations, evidence suggests negotiated agreements, trade partnerships, and cultural accommodation rather than prolonged warfare. This approach contrasts sharply with imperial expansionism elsewhere in the Mediterranean, emphasizing economic utility over territorial acquisition. By the 7th century BCE, Carthage had emerged as the most prominent Phoenician colony. Founded by settlers from Tyre, it rapidly became a central node in Western Mediterranean trade networks. Its strategic location along the North African coast allowed it to control routes to Iberia, Sardinia, and Sicily, integrating both local resources and maritime infrastructure. Excavations reveal harbor constructions, urban planning, and administrative facilities that reflect lessons learned from earlier, smaller colonies. Carthage illustrates the culmination of Phoenician colonization strategy, a settlement optimized for commerce, resilient in diplomacy, and capable of exerting influence without direct conquest. The establishment of colonies between 900 and 700 BCE demonstrates that Phoenician expansion was fundamentally pragmatic. It combined resource security, logistical foresight, economic integration, and cultural continuity into a replicable model that maintained metropolitan influence without imperial control. Archaeological continuity, material evidence, and inscriptions confirm that these settlements functioned as cooperative extensions of their cities, rather than as provincial appendages. Trade expansion through these colonies laid the foundation for broader Western influence. Secure ports, specialized production centers, and integrated maritime networks enabled Phoenician cities to reach further into the Mediterranean. setting the stage for the rise of Carthage as a dominant economic and cultural force in the Western Mediterranean. These developments illustrate how a civilization could project power and sustain prosperity through commerce and connectivity rather than territorial conquest. A colony surpassed its homeland. Carthage, traditionally founded in 814 BCE by settlers from Tyre, represents the culmination of Phoenician colonization in the Western Mediterranean. Archaeological and textual sources indicate that Carthage initially mirrored the urban and commercial structures of its Levantine progenitors but rapidly developed distinctive political and economic institutions adapted to the Western context. Its location on the North African coast, near fertile hinterlands and sheltered harbors, provided strategic advantages for trade, resource extraction, and maritime control, allowing the city to consolidate power beyond the scale of any single Levantine city-state. The growth of Carthage was facilitated by geographic and economic factors. Situated near natural harbors with access to grain, metals, and timber, Carthage could sustain large-scale shipbuilding and provisioning for extensive maritime networks. Archaeological surveys reveal urban expansion, harbor fortifications, and systematic planning, indicating that city authorities coordinated both commercial and civic activity. These physical infrastructures supported rapid population growth and allowed Carthage to establish itself as a logistical hub for trade routes linking Iberia, Sardinia, Sicily, and the broader Mediterranean. Carthage's political system diverged from the monarchic-oligarchic models of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. While early colonies retained kingship, Carthage increasingly emphasized republican institutions centered on a council of elders, elected magistrates, and assemblies of citizens. Classical authors such as Aristotle and later Roman historians describe a dual leadership of Sophites, chief magistrates, supported by the council, the Senate, and a citizen assembly, creating a system in which executive, legislative, and judicial functions were distributed rather than concentrated. Inscriptions and Punic legal texts corroborate this division, indicating structured decision-making processes, codified laws, and oversight mechanisms that limited individual authority. Economic organization in Carthage was closely tied to its political structure. Merchant elites and civic authorities collaborated to regulate maritime trade, taxation, and resource allocation. Harbor records and material evidence demonstrate standardized management of shipping, cargo, and storage facilities. The city maintained fleets for both commercial and defensive purposes, ensuring control over sea lanes while protecting trade interests. Unlike Levantine city-states, which relied on tribute to imperial powers, Carthage leveraged its geographic position and naval capacity to exercise direct influence over its Western Mediterranean networks, integrating multiple colonies and resource zones under coordinated management. Carthage's expansion was strategic rather than coercive. Outposts and satellite settlements along North African coasts and in Western islands functioned as trade nodes rather than territories administered through conquest. Archaeological evidence from Motia, Panormus, and Utica indicates that these sites maintained local governance while contributing to a broader Carthaginian commercial and logistical system. The city's political innovation, combining republican administration with maritime coordination, enabled the management of extensive trade networks without centralizing land-based empire building, reflecting an adaptation to the economic realities of Western Mediterranean commerce. Military organization, while secondary to economic strategy, was nonetheless critical to Carthage's rise. Naval forces were maintained to secure shipping lanes, protect colonies, and deter rivals. Classical sources describe fleets capable of rapid deployment across hundreds of kilometers of open sea. Archaeological findings, including shipyards and harbor fortifications, confirm investment in naval infrastructure, demonstrating that military capacity was intertwined with trade protection rather than territorial conquest. The city's reliance on maritime defense reflects continuity with Levantine priorities, but on a far larger scale, supporting the assertion that Carthage combined commerce and security in a coordinated strategy. Cultural continuity reinforced cohesion. Carthage maintained Phoenician religious practices, including the worship of Melkart, Astarte, and Tanit, while adapting rituals to local contexts. Temples and sanctuaries functioned as centers of civic life and economic coordination, integrating religious authority with political and commercial oversight. Inscriptions indicate that priests were involved in the administration of funds, trade contracts, and public works, reflecting the embedded role of religious institutions in governance and urban management. By the 7th century BCE, Carthage had achieved dominance over Western Phoenician settlements. Its political and economic structures allowed it to coordinate long-distance trade, manage resource extraction, and project influence without establishing a formal territorial empire. The city's fleet, commercial reach, and republican governance provided a model of sustainable maritime power, surpassing the scale and influence of any single Levantine city-state. Carthage's emergence reshaped Phoenician influence across the Mediterranean. Its leadership in Western trade networks allowed it to consolidate colonies, standardize practices, and facilitate cultural transmission across regions. Unlike Levantine cities, whose autonomy limited collective action, Carthage exercised central coordination while respecting local settlement independence. This combination of political innovation, economic strategy, and maritime capability established Carthage as the preeminent Western Phoenician power, setting the stage for its enduring prominence in the Mediterranean for centuries to come. Commerce redefined geography. Phoenician expansion across the Western Mediterranean created a network of interconnected settlements that transformed regional economies, urban patterns, and cultural exchange. From Iberia to North Africa, colonies such as Gader, Utica, and Motia acted as nodes linking local resources to the broader Mediterranean trade system. Archaeological surveys reveal the presence of Phoenician ceramics, amphory, metalwork, and inscriptions far beyond the Levant, demonstrating that these settlements were not isolated outposts but active participants in an integrated commercial network. In Iberia, the concentration of metal resources, particularly silver, tin, and copper, attracted Phoenician attention as early as the late 9th century BCE. Excavations at Gader, modern Cadiz, and surrounding coastal settlements reveal extensive harbor installations, warehouses, and workshops. Standardized amphory, weights, and seals indicate that trade was organized, systematic, and regulated by merchant elites with connections to Tyre and Sidon. Local populations were incorporated into production and exchange networks, providing labor, raw materials, and specialized knowledge, while the Phoenician presence facilitated access to distant markets in the eastern Mediterranean. North African settlements functioned similarly. Sites such as Utica, Kerkouane, and later Carthage itself coordinated the flow of agricultural goods, timber, and metals. Harbor constructions and quays indicate the capacity to receive and dispatch significant cargoes, while artifacts such as Punic inscriptions and imported pottery show both administrative oversight and cultural continuity. These nodes served as transshipment points, allowing goods to move efficiently between production zones, local markets, and Phoenician metropolitan cities. The network's architecture reflects deliberate planning. Colonies were located near navigable rivers, natural harbors, and trade-accessible hinterlands, optimizing both logistics and security. Economic integration extended beyond raw materials. Luxury goods, including purple-dyed textiles, finely crafted metalwork, and glassware, circulated along these routes, creating cross-regional demand and sustaining artisan industries. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that workshops in colonial settlements produced both local and imported goods, indicating that production was tailored to meet regional preferences and export markets. Administrative artifacts, such as seal impressions, accounting tablets, and standardized weights, confirm that local and metropolitan authorities coordinated commercial operations systematically. The Phoenician network also facilitated cultural exchange. Inscriptions, architectural styles, and religious artifacts spread along trade routes, creating shared norms across distant communities. Temples dedicated to Melkart, Astarte, and Tanit appear throughout the Western Mediterranean, often alongside indigenous practices, illustrating a blending of cultural elements without imposing direct political control. Iconographic analysis of ceramics and votive objects demonstrates stylistic continuity with the Levant while integrating local motifs, highlighting the adaptability and resilience of Phoenician culture. Interaction with indigenous populations was generally cooperative. Archaeological layers show continuity in native material culture alongside Phoenician imports, suggesting coexistence rather than displacement. Settlements functioned as intermediaries. They introduced new commodities and techniques while relying on local labor, knowledge, and resources. This mutual engagement facilitated the spread of agricultural, metallurgical, and artisanal practices, accelerating economic and technological development across the region. The operational sophistication of Western Mediterranean networks relied on maritime and administrative coordination. Phoenician colonies maintained fleets capable of transporting goods efficiently between nodes, while harbor infrastructure supported storage, repair, and redistribution. Merchants and civic authorities worked in tandem to manage long-distance logistics, including cargo accounting, fleet scheduling, and local integration. Epigraphic evidence indicates that colonies operated under semi-autonomous governance while remaining connected to parent cities, creating a flexible and resilient system capable of adapting to market fluctuations, environmental conditions, or political pressures. Trade specialization within the network further strengthened cohesion. Iberian colonies concentrated on metals, North African ports on grain and timber, and Central Mediterranean islands on artisan production and strategic logistics. This division of labor encouraged interdependence among settlements, ensuring that goods flowed efficiently and that no single colony could monopolize essential resources. Standardized weights, amphorae, and trade seals provided consistency across regions, enabling trust and reliability in transactions, even over hundreds of kilometers. The Western Mediterranean network's integration extended the influence of Phoenician culture and commerce far beyond the Levantine coast. It established enduring patterns of exchange, colonization, and cultural transmission that persisted through the first millennium BCE. By facilitating the flow of commodities, ideas, and technology, these networks transformed both geography and society. Islands, river valleys, and coastal plains were linked not by political domination but by the operational logic of trade. Cultural systems, reinforced through shared religion, writing, and material practices, maintained cohesion across these distances. Temples, workshops, and civic institutions in colonies mirrored those of metropolitan cities, embedding administrative and ritual norms into daily life. Merchant families and civic councils coordinated economic activity while sustaining social structures that preserved Phoenician identity, ensuring that the Western Mediterranean network functioned as a coherent extension of Levantine civilization despite geographic separation. The integration of Iberia, North Africa, and Central Mediterranean settlements demonstrates how Phoenician commerce redefined the Mediterranean landscape. By combining logistical sophistication, economic specialization, and cultural transmission, Phoenicians created a resilient, decentralized network. These developments enabled expansion without conquest, strengthened urban autonomy, and laid the groundwork for the political and economic transformations that would characterize Carthage's ascendancy and the broader Western Mediterranean Phoenician presence. Religion structured the city. Phoenician society was deeply integrated with religious practice, with the pantheon of deities shaping political, economic, and social life. Central among these gods were Baal, associated with storms and fertility, Astarte, linked to fertility and maritime protection, and Melkart, the patron deity of Tyre, who symbolized both civic identity and commercial prosperity. Archaeological evidence from urban sanctuaries, inscriptions, and votive offerings demonstrates that worship extended beyond private devotion, influencing governance, trade, and urban organization. Temples served as both spiritual centers and hubs for civic administration, reflecting the intertwining of religion and societal structure. Urban temples, particularly those dedicated to Melkart and Astarte, played multifunctional roles. Excavations at Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon reveal temple complexes containing storage facilities, workshops, and administrative spaces. These structures were instrumental in regulating economic activity, including the collection of offerings, management of trade goods, and coordination of labor for public projects. Religious authorities often participated in civic decision-making, demonstrating that temple institutions provided both spiritual oversight and practical governance. Inscriptions on stele and dedicatory plaques confirm the involvement of priests in overseeing economic transactions and enforcing contractual obligations. Ritual practice reinforced social cohesion and civic identity. Festivals dedicated to specific deities served as periodic markers of economic and political cycles. Archaeological remains of sacrificial installations, ceremonial vessels, and votive objects indicate structured participation in these rituals across social strata, from elites to artisans. Public ceremonies validated the authority of city councils and kings by linking temporal power to divine sanction. By embedding political legitimacy within religious practice, Phoenician society maintained hierarchical stability while coordinating complex urban and maritime economies. The pantheon also reflected local variations and civic affiliations. While Melkart was central to Tyre, Byblos emphasized Balat Jebel, and Sidon maintained cults of Astarte alongside other regional deities. This distribution of divine patronage reinforced city identity and competitive prestige, encouraging civic elites to invest in religious infrastructure and sponsorship. Archaeologists have uncovered elaborate temple foundations, altars, and inscriptions attesting to dedications from royal families and merchant guilds, highlighting the mutual reinforcement of economic and spiritual authority. Economic function was inseparable from religious practice. Temples often controlled storage and redistribution of goods, including agricultural produce, timber, and craft materials. Evidence from Byblos and Tyre indicates that offerings to deities were recorded and sometimes used as collateral in commercial agreements. The centralization of these resources within temple precincts facilitated both ritual observance and efficient management of civic assets. Priestly oversight ensured accountability, maintained standardized measures, and enabled integration of local and international trade networks. Religious beliefs also shaped maritime and colonial expansion. Deities like Astarte and Melkart were invoked for safe passage, successful trade ventures, and protection of settlements abroad. Inscriptions from Western Mediterranean colonies demonstrate continuity in ritual practice, with temple dedications, votive offerings, and festival observances mirroring those of the Levantine homeland. This facilitated cultural cohesion across geographically dispersed communities, linking distant settlements through shared spiritual and institutional frameworks. Material culture illustrates the integration of religion into daily life. Figurines, amulets, and inscribed stelae found in domestic, commercial, and civic contexts reveal pervasive devotional activity. Symbols associated with specific deities served not only as markers of faith, but also as instruments of social identity and economic negotiation. For example, Melkart's emblem appears on weights, seals, and harbor installations, demonstrating the blending of religious authority with administrative and commercial oversight. Priestly and civic hierarchies intersected in the administration of justice and governance. Inscriptions document priestly mediation in disputes and the ratification of contracts, reinforcing legal authority derived from divine endorsement. This combination of spiritual sanction and bureaucratic function helped stabilize city-states by integrating moral, economic, and political obligations within a coherent institutional framework. Social norms, including obligations to rulers, merchants, and neighbors, were thus codified and reinforced through religious practice. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Phoenician religious systems had become essential instruments of urban organization and social stability. Temples acted as centers of worship, economic management, civic administration, and cultural continuity, ensuring that religious, commercial, and political life remained intertwined. The pantheon, varying between cities yet broadly consistent in hierarchy and function, provided a framework for social cohesion, legitimized authority, and coordinated complex economic networks. Belief systems reinforced political legitimacy and prepared the city-state for both economic expansion and overseas colonization. The integration of religion with governance allowed Phoenician elites to mobilize resources, oversee trade, and maintain cohesion across both local populations and distant colonies. This institutional synergy between the sacred and the civic ensured that Phoenician culture could persist, adapt, and project influence across the Mediterranean, sustaining the civilization's social and political infrastructure for centuries. Trade shaped social order. Phoenician society was organized around clearly defined social strata, reflecting both economic specialization and civic structure. At the top were merchant elites and urban administrators, whose wealth derived from maritime trade, craft production, and management of resources. These individuals often participated in political councils, temple administration, and commercial partnerships, consolidating influence through both economic and civic authority. Archaeological evidence, including inscribed seals, luxury goods, and administrative records, demonstrates the integration of commercial power with civic governance. Artisans and skilled laborers formed a secondary tier, responsible for producing textiles, metalwork, glassware, and ship components. Excavations of workshops in Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos reveal standardized tools, molds, and workspaces, indicating organized production under the supervision of merchant sponsors or temple authorities. These craftspeople maintained essential functions within urban economies, supporting both local consumption and long-distance trade, and often lived near their workplaces in densely organized neighborhoods. Laborers and agricultural workers made up the broader base of the population. These individuals supplied food, timber, and raw materials for both domestic use and export. Archaeological surveys of rural settlements and field systems demonstrate systematic cultivation of grains, olives, and grapes, supporting urban centers and sustaining surplus for trade. In coastal areas, dock workers, sailors, and port laborers were critical to maintaining maritime operations, providing the manpower necessary for loading, repair, and navigation of ships. Enslaved individuals occupied the lowest tier of Phoenician society. Material evidence, including domestic quarters and burial remains, indicates that slaves were employed in agriculture, workshops, and temple service. Inscriptions and administrative records from urban centers suggest that while some slaves were permanent, others were temporary laborers attached to specific projects or voyages. Their labor supported economic productivity and facilitated the accumulation of wealth among elites, underscoring the structural dependence of the social system on coerced work. Burial practices provide insight into social distinctions and daily life. Elite tombs, such as those discovered at Byblos and Tyre, contain inscribed stele, luxury goods, and imported items, reflecting status and wealth. In contrast, simpler graves of artisans and laborers show modest goods and limited inscriptions, while the interment of enslaved individuals often lacks markers entirely. These patterns indicate a society conscious of hierarchy, codifying status both in life and in death, and reveal the material and symbolic dimensions of social stratification. Domestic architecture further reflects social differentiation. Wealthy merchants and city officials resided in multi-room houses with courtyards, storage areas, and workshop spaces, enabling the integration of family, commerce, and administrative functions. Artisans typically occupied smaller, contiguous dwellings clustered near production sites, while laborers lived in simpler quarters closer to ports or fields. Settlement layouts demonstrate deliberate spatial organization, balancing proximity to work, access to trade routes, and community cohesion. Economic activity permeated daily life, reinforcing social roles. Merchants coordinated trade, oversaw shipping, and managed surplus. Artisans and laborers produced goods and maintained infrastructure, and slaves provided essential labor. Inscriptions and accounting records from workshops, harbors, and temples indicate systematic record-keeping, standardized weights, and regulated transactions. Civic institutions and merchant councils mediated disputes and maintained order, ensuring that social functions aligned with economic priorities. Cultural practices, including religious observance, festivals, and education, were also stratified. Elite participation in temple rituals and sponsorship of public ceremonies reinforced social prestige. Skilled artisans often contributed to religious iconography or temple construction, linking their labor to civic and spiritual life. Lower-status individuals participated primarily as laborers or attendants, with limited access to formalized religious or political authority. This hierarchy ensured continuity of social norms and reinforced civic cohesion across urban and colonial contexts. Phoenician social organization extended beyond the Levant through trade and colonization. Merchant families and elites often traveled to Western Mediterranean settlements, establishing networks of influence while transmitting social norms, professional skills, and material culture. Artisans and laborers followed, ensuring continuity in production techniques and urban function. Burial practices, domestic architecture, and craft specialization in colonies mirror those of metropolitan cities, demonstrating how social hierarchies were replicated and adapted across diverse environments. By the first millennium BCE, the structure of Phoenician society, centered on commerce, craft production, labor, and hierarchical oversight, enabled both economic resilience and cultural transmission. Social differentiation ensured that urban centers functioned efficiently, that surplus could be mobilized for trade and infrastructure, and that cultural practices, including governance, religion, and craft knowledge, could be maintained and exported. Cultural practices and social organization were therefore not confined to the Levant, but were actively projected abroad, providing cohesion across colonies and supporting the integration of Western Mediterranean settlements into the broader Phoenician network. This systemic replication of hierarchy and daily life reinforced identity, facilitated economic efficiency, and sustained Phoenician influence across the Mediterranean world. Phoenician art traveled farther than armies. Phoenician artisans were central to the civilization's cultural footprint, producing works that combined indigenous styles with Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Aegean influences. Archaeological finds from Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon reveal a sophisticated material culture, including metalwork, ivory carvings, glassware, and ceramics. These artifacts demonstrate both technical skill and aesthetic versatility, reflecting the demands of local elites, temple institutions, and international markets. By blending foreign motifs with local traditions, Phoenicians created a recognizable artistic language that could be transmitted across their trade networks without political imposition. Metalwork exemplifies Phoenician craftsmanship. Bronze and gold objects, including ceremonial vessels, jewelry, and weapon fittings, incorporate iconography from Egypt, such as lotus motifs and winged figures, alongside Levantine symbolic forms. Inscriptions on some items record dedication to deities or civic patrons, linking artistry to religious and social structures. The technical sophistication required for casting, engraving, and inlay demonstrates specialized knowledge that was taught within guilds and families, ensuring continuity across generations. Ivory and bone carving illustrate the Phoenicians' role as cultural intermediaries. Excavations in Sidon and Byblos have uncovered furniture inlays, figurines, and decorative plaques that combine Assyrian and Egyptian imagery with local motifs. These works often reached markets across the Mediterranean, influencing artistic practices in Cyprus, Sardinia, and the Central Aegean. The widespread distribution of Phoenician imports demonstrates that their art was not only a product of local expression, but also a vector for cultural exchange, shaping the aesthetics of distant societies. Glassmaking was another area of Phoenician innovation. Workshops in Tyre and Sidon produced colored glass beads, vessels, and decorative items, techniques later adopted by Greek and Etruscan artisans. Evidence of kiln structures and raw material procurement shows organized, large-scale production. These goods were highly prized in both elite and ceremonial contexts, facilitating social prestige and trade diplomacy. Glass artifacts in Iberia, North Africa, and Italy attest to the mobility of Phoenician cultural influence, carried alongside commercial exchange. Ceramics reflect both utility and artistry. Amphorae, jars, and tableware display functional standardization alongside decorative patterns that reflect cross-cultural inspiration. Motifs include geometric designs, stylized animals, and mythological scenes influenced by neighboring civilizations. The replication of these forms in colonial settlements indicates that Phoenician artisans adapted metropolitan styles to local conditions while preserving recognizable cultural markers. Phoenician art also influenced Mediterranean neighbors directly. Greek pottery, particularly in the Orientalizing period, exhibits motifs and technical approaches derived from Phoenician prototypes, including floral patterns, mythological creatures, and use of stylized animal forms. Etruscan metalwork similarly reflects Phoenician iconography, especially in ceremonial objects and jewelry. These stylistic transmissions were often mediated through trade networks, illustrating how commerce and craft enabled soft power and cultural integration without military conquest. Religious and civic functions intersected with artistic production. Temples and sanctuaries were adorned with carved reliefs, votive offerings, and decorative installations that reinforced urban identity and spiritual practice. Artifacts often carried inscriptions or symbolic imagery that linked the material object to both divine patronage and civic status. This integration of function, symbolism, and technical expertise illustrates the systemic role of art in Phoenician society, connecting aesthetic production with social, religious, and economic structures. Workshops and artisan communities maintained continuity through apprenticeship and familial transmission of skills. Evidence from urban excavation layers shows designated production areas adjacent to residential zones, suggesting integration of craft practice into daily life and community organization. Collaboration between artisans, merchants, and religious institutions facilitated both local consumption and international export, embedding art within broader commercial and social networks. By the first millennium BCE, Phoenician craft and art had established a recognizable visual language that extended across the Mediterranean. Metalwork, ivory carving, glassmaking, and ceramics became instruments of cultural transmission, linking Levantine metropolitan centers with Western colonies and distant markets. The replication, adaptation, and incorporation of these styles by Greek, Etruscan, and Iberian societies demonstrate that Phoenician artistic influence was extensive, durable, and functionally connected to trade, religion, and civic identity. Written communication amplified this cultural reach. Inscriptions on ceramics, metalwork, and monuments reinforced language, iconography, and civic or religious claims, allowing cultural markers to persist and circulate across settlements. Combined with visual motifs, these artifacts created an enduring system of cultural influence that extended Phoenician identity far beyond the Levantine coast, laying the groundwork for later Mediterranean artistic traditions. 22 symbols changed history. The Phoenician alphabet represents one of the most significant innovations in the ancient Mediterranean, combining simplicity, flexibility, and utility to facilitate commerce, administration, and cultural transmission. Unlike earlier cuneiform or hieroglyphic systems, which relied on hundreds of logograms and syllabic signs, the Phoenician script used 22 consonantal symbols to represent spoken sounds. Archaeological finds, including inscriptions on stele, pottery, and commercial records from Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, indicate widespread application for both civic and economic purposes, demonstrating its integration into daily urban life. The alphabet's efficiency made it particularly suited for trade. Merchants needed a writing system capable of recording transactions, labeling goods, and documenting contracts without excessive complexity. Archaeological examples include ceramic amphorae marked with destination, contents, and merchant symbols, as well as inscriptions on metal goods denoting ownership or origin. This straightforward encoding enabled rapid literacy among traders, administrators, and scribes, reducing reliance on specialized scholars and facilitating broader participation in economic networks. Phoenician inscriptions appear across urban and colonial contexts, reflecting both local and international use. Inscriptions from Cyprus, Sardinia, and the Iberian coast demonstrate that the script was employed to record commercial agreements, dedicate offerings, and mark territorial claims. Its mobility across the Mediterranean was aided by the Phoenicians' extensive trade networks, which allowed both letters and literacy to circulate alongside goods, embedding the script in multiple cultural and geographic settings without requiring centralized governance. The alphabet's design reflects a deliberate adaptation to the phonology of Canaanite languages. Symbols such as Aleph, Beth, and Gimel corresponded to consonantal sounds, with vowel sounds inferred contextually. This system minimized ambiguity while maintaining adaptability for multiple dialects and languages. Archaeologists note inscriptions showing minor regional variants, suggesting that the script could be modified for local use while remaining intelligible across networks, a feature that facilitated trade, diplomacy, and colonization. The transformative effect of the Phoenician alphabet is most evident in its adoption by the Greeks. By the 8th century BCE, Greek traders and settlers modified the consonantal system, adding symbols for vowel sounds to accommodate their language. This adaptation catalyzed the development of widespread literacy, enabling the creation of literature, legal codes, and historical records. The simplicity of the Phoenician model allowed its diffusion to subsequent Mediterranean cultures, including the Etruscans and Romans, laying the foundation for alphabets that endure to this day. Administrative use of the alphabet underpinned urban and commercial organization. Civic authorities, temple officials, and merchant families utilized inscriptions to manage contracts, record tribute, and coordinate logistics. Examples from Byblos and Tyre include dedicatory stele documenting temple offerings, while harbor inscriptions tracked cargoes and shipping schedules. The alphabet's accessibility allowed administrators to maintain accountability and standardize practices across both metropolitan and colonial contexts, enhancing operational efficiency. Written communication also reinforced social and economic hierarchies. Ownership marks, contract inscriptions, and dedicatory texts validated property rights, obligations, and privileges. Seal impressions bearing Phoenician letters appear alongside these texts, confirming the authentication of transactions and providing evidence for the interaction between literacy and commerce. By enabling precise record-keeping, the script strengthened institutional authority without centralizing power, aligning with the decentralized structure of Phoenician city-states and colonies. The role of the alphabet in cultural transmission extended beyond administration and trade. Religious inscriptions on temple walls, votive objects, and stele standardized rituals and commemorated civic achievements. Written dedications allowed religious and civic institutions to project authority and maintain continuity across generations. In colonies, these inscriptions reinforced Levantine identity, enabling diaspora communities to maintain social cohesion while interacting with local populations. Material evidence suggests that literacy using the Phoenician alphabet was practical and widespread, though not universal. Inscriptions on everyday objects indicate functional literacy among merchants, craftsmen, and civic officials, while monumental and ceremonial texts preserved formal, high-status communication. This dual usage illustrates the script's adaptability. It served both routine commercial purposes and the projection of authority, demonstrating how a simple writing system could support complex urban and interregional networks. By facilitating trade, administration, and cultural cohesion, the Phoenician alphabet underpinned the broader mechanisms of knowledge transmission. Its efficiency allowed colonial settlements, maritime networks, and metropolitan cities to maintain communication, coordinate commerce, and reinforce identity. This innovation was not merely a technical achievement. It provided the structural infrastructure for economic expansion, social organization, and cultural influence throughout the Mediterranean. Administrative structures built on the alphabet ensured that these commercial systems operated reliably and efficiently. The ability to document agreements, track goods, and regulate interactions allowed Phoenician merchants and city authorities to expand trade networks with confidence, mitigating risk and supporting long-distance exchange. Combined with maritime expertise, colonial logistics, and institutional frameworks, the alphabet was a key enabler of Phoenician influence, laying the groundwork for both commercial dominance and the diffusion of literacy across the ancient Mediterranean. Efficiency replaced empire. Phoenician city-states maintained administrative order without centralized territorial control, relying on systematic record-keeping to coordinate commerce, governance, and civic functions. Archaeological evidence, including inscribed stele, clay tablets, and seal impressions, demonstrates that bureaucratic practices were highly developed despite the absence of an overarching imperial apparatus. Merchants, temple officials, and civic authorities used these tools to document transactions, track resources, and enforce obligations, ensuring the reliability of both economic and social systems. Inscriptions on amphorae, storage jars, and trade goods indicate careful tracking of cargo, origin, and ownership. Standardized weights and measures, attested by surviving bronze and stone balances, allowed merchants and officials to verify quantities across settlements. Seal impressions preserved on containers and documents authenticated transactions, protecting property rights and minimizing disputes. These mechanisms functioned as decentralized governance tools, providing accountability without requiring coercive power over populations or territories. Temple administrations played a central role in bureaucratic practices. Priests oversaw the collection of offerings, management of grain, timber, and metal reserves, and recording of contractual agreements. Inscriptions and dedicatory texts indicate that religious institutions acted as trusted intermediaries in economic and civic life. This integration of spiritual and administrative authority allowed city-states to regulate commerce, coordinate labor, and mobilize resources efficiently, demonstrating a form of governance grounded in procedural oversight rather than centralized command. Municipal councils and magistrates coordinated civic functions alongside temple authorities. Inscriptions from Byblos and Tyre record decisions regarding harbor management, tax collection, and commercial disputes. Civic and commercial responsibilities were distributed among elite families and merchant guilds, creating overlapping structures of accountability. This system ensured operational consistency across urban centers while preserving political autonomy, illustrating how decentralized governance could sustain complex societies. Colonial settlements replicated these practices. Inscriptions and seal impressions at Western Mediterranean colonies, including Gader and Motia, show that record-keeping systems were exported alongside trade networks. Local officials maintained inventories, tracked shipments, and recorded agreements, mirroring metropolitan methods. These practices allowed distant settlements to operate effectively and maintain integration with broader Phoenician commercial networks without relying on direct imperial oversight. The effectiveness of these systems highlights the adaptive nature of Phoenician administration. By focusing on documentation, verification, and distributed authority, city-states maintained economic cohesion, social order, and inter-settlement coordination. Written records enabled transparent accountability, reducing the risk of fraud or mismanagement while supporting the growth of trade and urban infrastructure. This model demonstrates that bureaucratic efficiency could replace the need for centralized territorial control, sustaining prosperity through procedural rigor. These administrative practices also facilitated the exchange of knowledge. Standardized documentation allowed technical, economic, and legal information to circulate across the Mediterranean, connecting metropolitan centers with colonies. Seal impressions, inscriptions, and accounting records transmitted practices in trade, taxation, and labor organization, indirectly influencing neighboring civilizations. Greek and later Roman observers adopted and adapted aspects of these methods, demonstrating the broader impact of Phoenician record-keeping on Mediterranean governance. By the first millennium BCE, Phoenician bureaucratic practices had established a reliable framework for urban administration, commercial regulation, and inter-settlement coordination. Inscriptions, seals, and standardized procedures ensured that city-states could operate efficiently, maintain economic stability, and integrate colonies into functional networks. These practices exemplify how knowledge, rather than centralized force, sustained Phoenician civilization, laying the foundation for both commercial success and cultural influence across the Mediterranean. The ability to coordinate commerce, manage resources, and regulate civic activity through documentation illustrates that effective governance can emerge from procedural structures rather than imperial authority. This decentralized efficiency allowed Phoenician networks to thrive, forming the backbone of a civilization whose influence extended through trade, culture, and written knowledge rather than through conquest. Influence without domination. Phoenician civilization exerted a remarkable impact across the Mediterranean not through territorial conquest but via sustained commercial and cultural exchange. Their networks of trade, colonization, and maritime communication facilitated the diffusion of technological, artistic, and linguistic innovations. Artifacts, inscriptions, and urban planning from Phoenician colonies in Iberia, Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa demonstrate that local societies adopted Phoenician methods in craft production, religious practice, and administration while maintaining political autonomy. This mode of influence relied on accessibility, practicality, and prestige, rather than coercion. The spread of the Phoenician alphabet illustrates this dynamic. Adapted by Greek communities in the 8th century BCE, the consonantal script was modified to include vowels, creating the foundation for Greek literacy and, subsequently, the Latin alphabet. Inscriptions from Cyprus, Malta, and the Iberian coast reveal that literacy traveled alongside trade commodities, facilitating record-keeping, contracts, and communication across diverse populations. By providing a simple, adaptable writing system, the Phoenicians enabled cultural integration without imposing political control, demonstrating a strategic form of soft power. Art and material culture were similarly transmitted. Phoenician metalwork, ivory carvings, and ceramics reached the central and western Mediterranean, influencing Greek, Etruscan, and Iberian artisans. Motifs such as floral designs, mythological creatures, and geometric patterns appear in foreign workshops, indicating emulation rather than forced adoption. Archaeological evidence shows that workshops in colonies often produced hybrid goods, combining Phoenician techniques with local styles. These interactions highlight the Phoenicians' ability to disseminate cultural practices through trade networks while respecting regional autonomy. Religious and civic practices also contributed to cultural transmission. Temples and colonies mirrored metropolitan layouts, while ritual objects, inscriptions, and dedicatory practices reinforced continuity of belief systems. Festivals, offerings, and administrative conventions were replicated in distant settlements, establishing shared norms that strengthened identity and facilitated cooperation. The replication of social and religious structures in colonies demonstrates that culture could propagate organically through networks of merchants, officials, and artisans, rather than via conquest. Economic knowledge further reinforced Phoenician influence. Standardized weights, amphory, and accounting practices spread through trade hubs, enabling distant communities to participate effectively in Mediterranean commerce. Inscriptions and seals provided models for contract recording and resource management, allowing local authorities to organize trade according to proven methods. By combining technological, artistic, and administrative expertise, the Phoenicians created enduring mechanisms for regional integration that transcended political boundaries. The cumulative effect of these transmissions was a Mediterranean system in which Phoenician innovations were embedded across diverse societies. Greek, Etruscan, Iberian, and North African cultures incorporated elements of Phoenician technology, writing, and craft without direct political subjugation. These exchanges demonstrate that influence can propagate through practical utility, prestige, and repeated interaction, establishing networks of knowledge and practice that shape civilizations over generations. By the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, the Phoenician model of indirect cultural influence had become a defining feature of Mediterranean interaction. Colonies and trade partners adopted, adapted, and localized Phoenician systems while retaining autonomy, creating a web of cultural continuity that connected geographically distant regions. This approach allowed Phoenician knowledge, practices, and innovations to endure long after the decline of metropolitan city-states, sustaining their legacy through practical and symbolic forms. The cumulative impact of Phoenician cultural transmission highlights a system of influence distinct from empire. Knowledge, technology, and artistic practices circulated through voluntary adoption, commercial networks, and institutional replication rather than coercion. These processes ensured that Phoenician contributions shaped Mediterranean civilization widely, providing foundations for subsequent economic, artistic, and linguistic developments across the region. Power dynamics shifted as rivals emerged, particularly with the rise of Carthage, Greek city-states, and later Mediterranean powers. Yet the foundational mechanisms of cultural transmission, trade, craft, literacy, and ritual continuity continued to enable Phoenician influence, demonstrating that sustained impact could be achieved without direct political domination. Trade-bred rivalry. The encounter between Phoenician and Greek traders in the central and western Mediterranean during the first millennium BCE was marked by both cooperation and competition. Greek colonization expanded across southern Italy and Sicily, intersecting with established Phoenician trading networks and colonies. Archaeological evidence from Motia, Panormus, and coastal settlements in Sicily reveals simultaneous occupation layers, imported ceramics, and shared architectural techniques, demonstrating that communities often coexisted while maintaining distinct cultural and economic spheres. The overlap of economic interests, particularly in grain, metals, and strategic maritime routes, generated tensions that occasionally escalated into localized conflict. Carthaginian involvement in these interactions arose from the need to defend Phoenician commercial interests. As Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos retained influence over distant colonies, Carthage assumed a leading role in coordinating military and diplomatic responses in the western Mediterranean. Inscriptions, harbor fortifications, and naval installations suggest that Carthaginian authorities maintained fleets capable of rapid deployment to protect trade hubs and counter emerging Greek settlements. This defensive posture emphasized the safeguarding of economic networks rather than territorial conquest, reflecting a continuity of Phoenician maritime priorities on a larger scale. Conflict was not constant or total. Archaeological layers indicate periods of negotiation, trade, and coexistence alongside skirmishes. Sites such as Mocha display evidence of destruction and rebuilding, implying episodic violence interspersed with commercial and cultural interaction. Greek colonies, while expanding their influence, relied on established Phoenician ports for maritime knowledge, technical expertise, and access to markets, creating mutual dependencies that tempered large-scale hostilities. These patterns illustrate that rivalry was managed pragmatically, with both sides balancing competition with opportunities for exchange. The competition also accelerated technological and organizational innovation. Both Phoenicians and Greeks adapted shipbuilding techniques, port infrastructure, and navigational practices to maintain commercial advantage. For Carthage, the necessity of defending trade routes stimulated fleet expansion and military coordination, preparing the city for a more prominent role in Western Mediterranean geopolitics. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks, harbor installations, and fortifications confirms the scale of investment in defensive capabilities, linking economic security directly to military preparedness. Cultural transmission continued despite friction. Phoenician artisanship, religious practice, and administrative knowledge persisted in colonies and neighboring settlements, even where Greek influence expanded. Iconographic evidence shows hybridization in pottery, metalwork, and religious artifacts, reflecting adaptation rather than replacement. These interactions demonstrate that competitive pressures did not erase Phoenician influence but encouraged strategic adaptation and selective incorporation of foreign elements. By the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, Carthage had emerged as the preeminent Phoenician power in the Western Mediterranean, assuming leadership in coordinating defenses, managing trade, and mediating intercolonial disputes. Its strategic position, maritime capabilities, and administrative systems enabled it to stabilize contested areas and maintain access to critical trade routes. Carthaginian authority extended protective oversight without direct territorial annexation, emphasizing the preservation of economic and cultural networks over expansionist conquest. Trade rivalry with Greek colonies, therefore, functioned as both a stimulus and a constraint. It encouraged Phoenician adaptation in military, commercial, and urban planning while shaping diplomatic strategies and alliances. The presence of Greek settlements in Sicily and southern Italy created enduring zones of interaction in which commerce, conflict, and cultural exchange were tightly interwoven. Archaeological and textual evidence collectively illustrates that competition was structured, episodic, and closely tied to the imperatives of maritime commerce. By the early 6th century BCE, Carthage's role in managing Phoenician interests in the Western Mediterranean was firmly established. Defensive coordination, fleet maintenance, and diplomatic engagement allowed Phoenicians to sustain their economic networks in the face of rising Greek influence. These interactions highlight the interplay between trade, rivalry, and strategic innovation, demonstrating how Phoenician city-states, through Carthage, projected power and preserved influence in a competitive Mediterranean landscape. Carthage's assumption of defensive leadership set the stage for the broader militarization and political consolidation that would characterize the Phoenician Western Mediterranean network, linking economic prosperity with strategic resilience and laying the foundation for future confrontations with emerging Mediterranean powers, commerce-funded armies. Carthage's military organization diverged from typical territorial empires, reflecting the city-state's mercantile priorities and decentralized origins. Unlike Greek or Assyrian polities, Carthage rarely conscripted citizen soldiers for sustained campaigns. Instead, the city relied heavily on mercenary forces drawn from across the Western Mediterranean, including Iberians, Libyans, Numidians, and Greeks. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts indicate that this practice allowed Carthage to mobilize professional, specialized troops without disrupting the city's commercial and civic operations, maintaining a balance between military readiness and economic productivity. Naval capability was central to Carthaginian military strategy. Phoenician heritage provided a sophisticated maritime tradition, and Carthage inherited this expertise, developing fleets capable of both defense and projection of power across the western Mediterranean. Excavations at Carthaginian harbors, including docking facilities, shipyards, and quays, reveal infrastructure designed to support large numbers of vessels and enable rapid deployment. Iconographic evidence, such as reliefs and coinage depicting biremes and triremes, further confirms the prominence of naval power in both defensive and offensive operations. The use of mercenaries allowed Carthage to maintain economic continuity while conducting military campaigns. Contracted forces were often specialized in particular skills, including infantry, cavalry, and archery, enabling Carthage to tailor its military composition according to the strategic needs of each campaign. Inscriptions and classical sources document treaties and payment systems for mercenary groups, illustrating that organized contractual agreements underpinned military logistics. This approach reduced reliance on citizen conscription, preserving the merchant class's capacity to manage trade networks and urban infrastructure. Naval dominance ensured that Carthage could protect maritime trade routes and colonies, which were critical to the city's wealth and influence. The construction of fortified harbors, watchtowers, and coastal garrisons provided security against piracy, Greek expansion, and local uprisings. Archaeological remains of defensive walls and towers in colonies such as Motia, Panormus, and Utica indicate that strategic points were actively fortified, demonstrating an integrated approach to naval and territorial defense. The combination of mercenary armies and maritime power allowed Carthage to project authority while minimizing the cost to its commercial base. Military campaigns also reflect adaptive strategy. Evidence from Sicily and Iberia demonstrates that Carthaginian forces integrated local contingents, exploiting regional knowledge and labor while maintaining command through centralized mercenary contracts. This flexible approach enabled Carthage to respond to evolving threats, secure resources, and enforce trade privileges without establishing extensive bureaucratic control over conquered territories. Coinage, inscriptions, and settlement patterns indicate that Carthaginian influence was often indirect, relying on alliances, vassalage, and commercial leverage rather than direct occupation. The strategic reliance on commerce and mercenaries allowed Carthage to expand gradually and efficiently. Trade revenues funded fleets, fortified settlements, and mercenary wages, creating a feedback loop in which economic prosperity reinforced military capability and military security protected economic networks. Epigraphic and material evidence demonstrates that administrative coordination of funds, resource allocation, and mercenary recruitment was systematic and integral to sustaining Carthage's Mediterranean presence. Naval innovations complemented land operations. Shipbuilding techniques, inherited from the Phoenician tradition, included reinforced hulls, standardized or arrangements, and modular construction suitable for rapid repairs. Ports and shipyards supported maintenance and fleet expansion, enabling sustained campaigns far from the metropolitan center. Classical accounts describe the integration of naval maneuvers with troop movements, emphasizing the symbiotic relationship between maritime dominance and land-based operations in Carthaginian strategy. By the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, Carthage had institutionalized these military practices. Mercenary recruitment, contract administration, and logistical coordination became formalized components of civic governance, supported by temple and civic authorities. Records of naval construction, harbor maintenance, and troop deployment illustrate that military capacity was closely intertwined with economic management. This system allowed Carthage to respond flexibly to threats, stabilize colonies, and protect maritime trade without diverting citizen labor from commercial enterprise. The evolution of Carthage's military established a model distinct from empires reliant on territorial conscription. Mercenaries provided flexibility and specialization, naval power secured trade routes and strategic points, and administrative oversight ensured operational continuity. This structure reinforced the city's dual identity as a commercial hub and military actor, demonstrating that effective defense and projection of power could be achieved without traditional territorial expansion or centralized manpower mobilization. Carthage's military evolution set the stage for emerging Mediterranean rivalries. As Rome began to enter the Western Mediterranean in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, The city's reliance on professional mercenaries and a dominant navy would be tested against a rising power that combined territorial conscription, citizen armies, and expansionist strategy. The interplay of commerce, mercenary forces, and naval infrastructure defined Carthage's approach to conflict, shaping the political and military dynamics of the region and preparing the city-state for prolonged engagement with new Mediterranean competitors. This adaptive military system ensured that Carthage could protect Phoenician networks, sustain economic growth, and project influence effectively, linking commercial strength to martial capability and positioning the city as the preeminent Phoenician power in the Western Mediterranean. A new power challenged the old. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Carthage had consolidated its role as the dominant Phoenician power in the Western Mediterranean. Its extensive network of colonies, fortified ports, and mercenary armies enabled control of trade routes from the Iberian Peninsula to North Africa. Carthage's wealth derived primarily from commerce, grain, timber, metals, and luxury goods, funding fleets, fortifications, and overseas settlements. However, this commercial dominance increasingly brought the city into competition with emerging powers, most notably Rome, whose expansionist policies and territorial ambitions began to intersect with Carthaginian interests in Sicily and southern Italy. The Western Mediterranean had long been a zone of strategic and economic importance. Carthaginian colonies in western Sicily, including Motia, Panormus, and Saguntum, secured grain shipments and trade in metals while providing bases for naval operations. Roman expansion from Latium into southern Italy brought the two powers into direct contact. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts from Polybius and Livy indicate that both Carthage and Rome recognized the island of Sicily as critical for maritime supremacy and access to essential resources. These overlapping spheres of influence set the stage for diplomatic tension and eventual armed confrontation. Political structures amplified the potential for conflict. Carthage's reliance on mercenary armies allowed rapid response but limited territorial occupation, leaving some border zones effectively under contested control. Roman republican institutions, by contrast, mobilized citizen soldiers to secure land and enforce political authority directly. The juxtaposition of Carthaginian commercial networks with Roman territorial expansion created friction over access to ports, trade agreements, and spheres of influence. Classical sources note disputes over tribute, taxation, and local alliances, reflecting the strategic complexity of the pre-Punic Mediterranean. Economic competition intensified these pressures. Sicily was rich in agricultural output, metals, and maritime resources, making it a focal point for both powers. Carthaginian colonies depended on secure trade and resource flows, while Roman allies in southern Italy sought both security and economic advantage. Control of harbors, markets, and shipping lanes became a critical concern for both civilizations. Evidence from excavated warehouses, fortified settlements, and shipping records indicates that economic interests were deeply intertwined with political and military calculations, heightening the potential for confrontation. Diplomacy and alliances played a central role in the prelude to conflict. Carthage relied on treaties, client settlements, and strategic marriages to secure influence, while Rome engaged with local Italic communities to expand its territorial base. These parallel systems of control occasionally overlapped, producing disputes over allegiances and obligations. Inscriptions and treaty fragments confirm that Carthage sought to stabilize frontier regions through formalized agreements, yet Rome's expansionist logic often ignored or undermined these arrangements, generating friction that would escalate to war. Military preparedness reflected the anticipation of conflict. Carthage maintained fleets capable of rapid deployment and fortified settlements across Sicily and North Africa. Mercenary forces, including Iberians, Libyans, and Gauls, were stationed strategically to respond to incursions or local uprisings. Roman preparations included citizen militias and legions structured for both offensive and defensive operations. Classical sources emphasize reconnaissance, fortification, and preemptive maneuvers as both powers sought advantage, indicating that both sides recognized the strategic significance of Sicily long before the outbreak of the First Punic War. Cultural and logistical factors also influenced the prelude to hostilities. Carthaginian administration, based on trade, mercenary coordination, and decentralized governance, contrasted with Rome's territorial bureaucracy and citizen-based mobilization. This divergence shaped conflict management, negotiation practices, and the conduct of military campaigns. Phoenician colonies relied on mercenary discipline and naval mobility, while Rome leveraged organized legions, allied contingents, and political oversight to exert control over contested regions. These structural differences would influence the dynamics and duration of ensuing warfare. The pre-Punic period demonstrates that conflict arose from systematic, interrelated pressures rather than sudden aggression. Carthaginian commercial dominance, Roman territorial expansion, strategic geography, and overlapping political interests created a situation in which confrontation became increasingly likely. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that trade disputes, territorial competition, and alliance conflicts were long-standing features of Mediterranean interaction, reflecting a continuum of rivalry rather than isolated incidents. The stage was set for prolonged warfare that would redefine both Phoenician and Mediterranean trajectories. By the early 3rd century BCE, these dynamics culminated in open confrontation, as Carthage and Rome contested control of Sicily and access to critical trade and resource networks. The combination of economic interdependence, strategic geography, and contrasting political systems created a volatile environment in which both powers sought to assert influence without provoking unnecessary disruption to broader commerce. These tensions ultimately erupted into the First Punic War, reshaping Phoenician destiny in the Western Mediterranean. Conflict, once initiated, would not only challenge Carthage's dominance but also redefine the balance of power in the region, illustrating how strategic, economic, and political pressures collectively precipitated large-scale confrontation and set the stage for the Punic Wars. War decided the Mediterranean's future. The First and Second Punic Wars represent a decisive phase in Phoenician, specifically Carthaginian, history, marking the transition from commercial dominance to strategic vulnerability. These conflicts were driven less by individual ambition and more by structural competition. Rome's territorial expansion intersected with Carthage's maritime and economic networks, particularly in Sicily and the Western Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from Sicilian settlements, shipwrecks, and fortifications demonstrates that control over trade routes, grain supplies, and strategic harbors was a central motivating factor, rather than mere imperial rivalry. This systemic perspective clarifies why the wars lasted over a century and reshaped Mediterranean geopolitics. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, arose from overlapping commercial and strategic interests in Sicily. Carthage had established colonies such as Motia, Panormus, and Lilybaeum to secure trade and resources. Roman expansion into southern Italy brought the Republic into proximity with these settlements, particularly as local Sicilian cities, such as Messana, requested Roman assistance against mercenary factions allied with Carthage. Archaeological layers in Motia and Panormus show destruction and reconstruction consistent with prolonged sieges, while shipwrecks indicate large-scale naval engagement. Both sides mobilized resources on an unprecedented scale, integrating fleets, mercenary armies, and allied contingents into sustained campaigns. Carthage's reliance on mercenary forces and naval expertise shaped the conflict's character. Mercenary armies provided flexibility, but often lacked cohesion during prolonged land campaigns, a challenge noted in epigraphic records and classical sources. Conversely, Carthage's fleet, rooted in Phoenician maritime tradition, allowed the city to contest Roman naval dominance. Innovations such as the Corvus boarding device, recorded by Polybius, demonstrate how tactical adaptation sought to overcome structural disadvantages. Roman expertise in land combat applied to maritime encounters. Despite initial successes, prolonged logistical strain and economic pressure eventually forced Carthage to negotiate peace, ceding Sicily to Rome and marking the Republic's first provincial acquisition. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, emerged from ongoing competition in Iberia and North Africa, where Carthage sought to rebuild resources and secure strategic bases. The rise of Hannibal Barca exemplifies the city's capacity to mobilize professional mercenary forces and project power over long distances, particularly through his campaigns in Iberia and the Italian peninsula. Archaeological evidence from Iberian sites such as New Carthage and Saguntum corroborates classical accounts of Carthaginian fortifications, urban planning, and military organization. While individual leadership is often emphasized in traditional narratives, structural factors, including control of trade, local alliances, and mercenary logistics, were decisive in shaping campaign outcomes. Hannibal's Italian campaign demonstrates the intersection of strategic initiative and systemic limitations. Mercenary armies, while highly mobile, were costly and dependent on continuous logistical support from Carthage and allied settlements. Meanwhile, Rome's citizen legion system provided sustainable manpower for prolonged engagement. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence shows Carthage's Iberian colonies contributed troops and supplies, but the distance and fragmentation of command constrained the city's capacity to maintain long-term campaigns. This structural imbalance underpinned Rome's eventual advantage, despite Hannibal's tactical brilliance. Naval warfare remained critical throughout both wars. Carthage's maritime tradition enabled supply lines, troop movements, and territorial defense, while Rome gradually developed a competent fleet to contest sea control. Shipwrecks and harbor fortifications across Sicily and the Western Mediterranean indicate extensive naval logistics, including the construction of shipyards and fortified anchorages. Control of maritime routes allowed both sides to mobilize resources efficiently, but Rome's gradual adaptation of Phoenician naval techniques ultimately offset Carthage's traditional advantage, demonstrating that technological and structural factors, rather than individual leadership alone, determined outcomes. Economic factors were equally decisive. Carthage's reliance on trade revenue to fund fleets and mercenary forces made prolonged conflict financially taxing. Rome, with access to Italian agricultural resources and a mobilizable citizen population, could sustain campaigns over decades. Inscriptions, coinage, and warehouse excavations reveal that Carthaginian fiscal strain increased after major naval losses, undermining the city's ability to maintain mercenary loyalty and operational effectiveness. The interplay between commerce, military logistics, and structural capacity underscores how systemic pressures shaped the course and outcome of the Punic Wars. By the end of the Second Punic War, Carthage had suffered decisive defeats on land and sea, culminating in the Treaty of 201 BCE. Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica were lost, Iberian holdings reduced, and indemnities imposed, significantly weakening Carthaginian economic and military capacity. Archaeological evidence, including fortification reductions and settlement contractions, corroborates the scale of structural loss. While Carthage remained a city-state with residual power, its independence was constrained, signaling a shift from Phoenician maritime primacy toward a subordinate role under Roman hegemony. The Punic Wars illustrate that Carthage's decline resulted from structural vulnerabilities rather than solely military miscalculations or individual failures. Dependence on mercenaries, reliance on maritime trade revenue, and geographic dispersion of colonies created conditions in which sustained conflict with a territorially organized and citizen-supported power like Rome was ultimately unsustainable. Material evidence supports this systemic interpretation, emphasizing that the wars were a contest of economic and administrative resilience as much as battlefield performance. The conclusion of the First and Second Punic Wars marked the end of Phoenician autonomy in the Western Mediterranean. Carthage retained some economic and cultural influence, but strategic control of trade routes and colonies shifted toward Rome. This transition set the stage for the final Punic confrontation and the broader incorporation of Phoenician networks into a Roman-dominated Mediterranean system. Defeat reshaped Phoenician destiny, illustrating how structural pressures, including economic dependence, mercenary reliance, and maritime logistics, determined outcomes as decisively as battlefield actions, establishing a new Mediterranean order centered on Roman ascendancy. A city fell, but not its legacy. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE marked a pivotal turning point in Phoenician history, representing both the final assertion of Roman dominance in the Western Mediterranean and the end of Carthage's political independence. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, was precipitated by sustained Roman concern over Carthage's economic recovery and potential resurgence. Unlike the previous Punic conflicts, this war was less about direct competition over trade routes and more about strategic elimination of a rival power. Archaeological evidence from Carthaginian sites, including urban layers, fortifications, and material culture, confirms extensive destruction and systematic dismantling of the city, yet also demonstrates that Punic culture persisted in both local and diasporic forms. Roman military operations in 149 BCE began with a blockade of Carthaginian ports, designed to cut off maritime supply lines and isolate the city economically. Classical accounts, corroborated by sediment analysis and harbor excavations, show that Carthage's naval and mercantile infrastructure was systematically targeted to neutralize its economic capacity. Roman forces established camps, siege works, and artillery positions, employing protracted tactics intended to exhaust Carthage's defenders and undermine urban resilience. Despite the city's formidable walls and prior fortifications, the prolonged siege eroded defensive capability, demonstrating the limits of mercenary reliance and localized military control against a centralized, territorially organized adversary. The final assault in 146 BCE resulted in the systematic destruction of the city. Excavations reveal widespread burning of public, religious, and residential buildings, accompanied by layers of collapsed masonry and charred material. Roman accounts describe mass casualties, deportation of survivors, and the complete dismantling of Carthaginian fortifications. The comprehensive nature of this destruction was intended to prevent Carthage from re-establishing political or military capacity, creating a vacuum in the Western Mediterranean previously occupied by Phoenician authority. Despite this physical devastation, archaeological evidence indicates that elements of Punic culture endured. Suburbs, satellite settlements, and rural sites continued to exhibit Carthaginian religious practices, funerary customs, and material culture. Inscriptions, religious stelae, and household artifacts demonstrate continuity in language, ritual, and local governance structures, even under Roman oversight. Coinage and trade artifacts suggest that Phoenician commercial practices persisted in North Africa and across surviving Mediterranean colonies, indicating that the cultural and economic frameworks developed over centuries remained influential despite the city's destruction. The persistence of Punic identity was also facilitated by diaspora communities. Carthaginian merchants and settlers had long established colonies and trade outposts across the Western Mediterranean, including Iberia, Sardinia, and coastal North Africa. These networks provided channels for maintaining cultural practices, language, and religious observances. Archaeological finds from these sites show continuity in religious iconography, commercial markings, and urban planning reflective of Carthaginian traditions, suggesting that Phoenician identity adapted to new circumstances rather than disappearing entirely. Economic structures underwent transformation but retained functional continuity. Roman authorities often co-opted Carthaginian trade networks, integrating experienced mercantile personnel and existing ports into the Roman economic system. Amphorae, warehouse foundations, and transport inscriptions indicate that maritime commerce continued, albeit under Roman regulation. Punic expertise in shipbuilding, navigation, and trade logistics remained valued, highlighting the enduring structural significance of Carthaginian systems even in the absence of political autonomy. Religious continuity was particularly notable. Temples and sanctuaries in peripheral regions continued to reflect Phoenician deities, including Baal-Hamon and Tanit, whose worship persisted into the Roman period. Funerary inscriptions and ritual artifacts indicate that family cults and civic religious practices adapted to Roman administration while preserving core elements of Punic spirituality. These findings underscore that cultural resilience can endure even after the systematic destruction of political centers. The urban landscape of Carthage itself was eventually repurposed under Roman colonization, but the material and cultural imprint of the city persisted. Excavations reveal that Roman planners incorporated elements of Carthaginian urban design into new infrastructure, including road grids, harbor arrangements, and residential layouts. Artifacts, inscriptions, and architectural motifs provide evidence that Punic technical knowledge and city planning practices influenced subsequent Roman development, demonstrating that the city's intellectual and practical legacy survived despite its physical destruction. The destruction of Carthage illustrates the structural vulnerabilities of a decentralized, commerce-dependent civilization facing a territorially organized, militarized state. Carthage's reliance on mercenary armies, long-distance colonies, and trade revenues, while effective against regional competitors, proved insufficient against Rome's sustained strategic pressure. Yet, the survival of Punic culture in diaspora communities and integrated economic networks demonstrates that identity and influence can persist beyond the fall of a political center. By 146 BCE, Carthage's political independence was irrevocably ended, yet the structural, cultural, and commercial legacies of Phoenician civilization continued to shape the Western Mediterranean. Trade practices, religious traditions, artistic motifs, and linguistic elements survived both in surviving colonies and within Roman administrative frameworks. Archaeological evidence indicates that the city's destruction marked a transition from autonomous Phoenician polity to a dispersed, adaptive cultural presence, preserving the foundations of Phoenician influence for subsequent generations. The fall of Carthage signaled not only the end of political independence but also the beginning of a transformation in Phoenician identity. While the city-state no longer exercised regional dominance, its cultural, economic, and technological contributions endured, influencing Roman administration, Mediterranean commerce, and material culture. This persistence underscores that the collapse of political institutions does not necessarily entail the erasure of civilization, and that Phoenician identity would continue to evolve and adapt in the centuries following the city's destruction. Phoenician civilization thus entered a new phase, politically subordinated yet culturally resilient, with its legacy embedded across the Mediterranean through commerce, religion, and diaspora networks, ensuring that Carthage's fall was a turning point rather than an endpoint. Integration replaced independence. Following the destruction of Carthage and the consolidation of Roman control over the Western Mediterranean, surviving Phoenician cities entered a new phase defined by imperial integration. Coastal cities such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, as well as Western Mediterranean settlements, were incorporated into Roman provincial structures, losing political autonomy but retaining critical economic and cultural functions. Archaeological evidence, including harbor installations, shipwrecks, and artisan workshops, demonstrates that Phoenician expertise in maritime commerce, craftsmanship, and navigation remained central to Roman logistical and commercial networks. Rather than diminishing Phoenician influence entirely, Roman administration leveraged these cities' capacities to support broader imperial objectives. Urban administration under Roman rule relied on a combination of local elites and imperial oversight. Inscriptions and municipal records from Tyre and Sidon indicate that city councils and magistrates continued to manage day-to-day affairs, such as harbor operations, taxation, and guild regulation, within the framework of Roman provincial law. This semi-autonomous arrangement allowed Rome to extract economic benefit while maintaining the operational continuity of Phoenician urban centers. By preserving local administrative structures, the Romans ensured stability and efficiency, reinforcing the functional relevance of Phoenician civic expertise. Economic activity remained a defining feature of these cities. Phoenician artisans and merchants continued to produce goods highly valued across the empire, including glassware, purple dye textiles, ceramics, and metalwork. Archaeological finds in Western Mediterranean colonies, such as amphorae marked with workshop stamps, reveal that production methods maintained traditional techniques while accommodating Roman demand. The persistence of these industries highlights the integration of Phoenician commercial networks into imperial supply chains, illustrating that economic specialization provided a measure of continuity despite the loss of political independence. Maritime operations were particularly significant. Phoenician shipbuilders and sailors supplied vessels for trade and transport, enabling Rome to maintain control over the Mediterranean while benefiting from local expertise. Port facilities at Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were upgraded and expanded under Roman oversight, as evidenced by harbor quays, lighthouse foundations, and dredged channels. Shipwrecks and cargo manifests show that Phoenician crews participated in both commercial and logistical transport, demonstrating that maritime knowledge remained a key factor in sustaining imperial commerce. This integration underscores a broader pattern in which Rome co-opted local capabilities to reinforce centralized authority. Cultural and religious continuity persisted alongside economic integration. Temples, inscriptions, and votive objects from the Roman period reveal that traditional Phoenician deities, including Melkart, Astarte, and Baal, continued to be worshipped, often syncretized with Roman divinities. Funerary practices, family cults, and civic rituals demonstrate continuity of identity, reflecting the adaptability of Phoenician cultural frameworks within imperial structures. Archaeological evidence of temple reconstruction and sustained cult activity indicates that local religious institutions maintained social cohesion, even as political authority shifted. The resilience of Phoenician urban networks facilitated broader Mediterranean connectivity. By maintaining harbor facilities, artisanal production, and administrative competence, these cities functioned as critical nodes in Rome's trade and communication systems. Inscriptions, shipping manifests, and amphora distributions reveal extensive integration of Phoenician cities into imperial logistics, connecting North Africa, Italy, Iberia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. This role reinforced both economic significance and cultural visibility, allowing Phoenician practices, language, and religious traditions to persist under imperial oversight. Social structures adapted to the new context. Elite families, previously linked to mercantile and political power, continued to influence municipal administration and trade, often collaborating with Roman officials to ensure continuity and prosperity. Labor organization, guild participation, and artisan networks remained operational, sustaining local economies while providing skilled personnel to support imperial objectives. This stability contributed to urban resilience, demonstrating that integration into a larger empire did not necessarily eliminate Phoenician social, economic, or cultural identity. The transition from independent city-states to integrated imperial centers illustrates the adaptability of Phoenician civilization. While sovereignty was curtailed, functional autonomy in commerce, craftsmanship, and civic administration persisted, allowing cities to retain relevance within the Roman system. Maritime knowledge, artisan expertise, and urban organization continued to shape regional economic dynamics, highlighting the structural endurance of Phoenician civilization despite political subordination. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence collectively demonstrates that the Phoenicians were able to preserve key aspects of their identity while contributing to a broader imperial framework. By the 1st century BCE, Phoenician cities had firmly established their role within the Roman Mediterranean. Harbor infrastructure, production networks, and skilled labor ensured that these cities remained essential to imperial logistics and commerce. Religious practices and cultural traditions continued in adapted forms, reflecting resilience and continuity. Integration replaced independence, yet Phoenician influence endured through economic, technological, and social contributions, creating a foundation for cultural memory that would persist long after political autonomy had ended. Cultural memory, reinforced by economic activity and social continuity, prepared Phoenician civilization for a period in which identity would transform from autonomous governance to enduring influence under empire, demonstrating that structural contributions, commerce, craftsmanship, and administration could outlast political sovereignty. Change did not mean disappearance. Following integration into the Roman Empire, Phoenician cities and communities experienced gradual transformation rather than abrupt erasure. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence from Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Western colonies indicates that language, religion, and social structures persisted alongside Roman administration. Inscriptions in the Punic language continued into the 1st century CE, often appearing on funerary stelae, religious dedications, and commercial markers. These examples demonstrate that literacy, identity, and civic practice were maintained for generations, highlighting cultural resilience despite political subordination. Religious practices adapted but remained distinctive. Temples to Melkart, Astarte, and Baal Hammon continued to function under Roman oversight, sometimes incorporating syncretic elements. Excavations of sanctuaries reveal continuity of ritual spaces, altars, and votive objects, confirming that religious life remained an integral part of social cohesion. Evidence from Carthaginian diaspora communities in North Africa and Iberia demonstrates that traditional cults survived, facilitating cultural memory and the transmission of identity across space. Economic and artisanal activity also contributed to survival. Phoenician crafts, glassmaking, purple dye production, and metalwork continued to serve local and imperial markets. Amphorae, Workshop tools and harbor facilities indicate that commercial networks remained operational, supporting both local economies and Roman supply chains. Maritime expertise allowed former Phoenician ports to function as logistical nodes for trade and communication, reinforcing continuity in social and economic organization. Social structures persisted through adaptation. Local elites often collaborated with Roman authorities, maintaining municipal administration, guild oversight, and mercantile leadership. Family lineages retained influence in civic and religious spheres, ensuring the continuity of social hierarchies. Evidence from inscriptions and tombs reflects sustained family networks and civic participation, illustrating that the integration of Phoenician communities into the Roman system did not erase cultural frameworks but repurposed them within imperial structures. Over time, linguistic decline occurred gradually, replaced by Latin and Greek in official and commercial contexts. But traces of Punic language survived in inscriptions and toponyms well into the early centuries CE. Religious continuity similarly persisted, with syncretism blending Phoenician and Roman elements. These patterns demonstrate that assimilation under empire was neither total nor immediate. Cultural identity adapted to new political realities while maintaining historical roots. Phoenician influence extended beyond tangible material culture. Maritime, administrative, and commercial expertise remained embedded in the Mediterranean economy, contributing to Roman logistical capacity. Trade practices, shipbuilding knowledge, and urban planning methods originating in Phoenician cities persisted, indirectly shaping imperial systems. Archaeological layers confirm that former Phoenician colonies and cities functioned as active nodes within wider Roman networks, preserving structural legacies long after political sovereignty ended. By the early centuries CE, Phoenician identity had transformed from independent city-state culture to integrated imperial civilization, retaining core elements of language, religion, economic activity, and social organization. These threads of continuity highlight the adaptive capacity of Phoenician communities, demonstrating that cultural endurance can outlast political autonomy and that civilization's influence often persists in subtle, systemic ways. History remembered the victors. Ancient narratives have shaped modern understanding of the Phoenicians, often through the lens of Greek and Roman authors. Greek writers such as Herodotus and Thucydides emphasized Phoenician mercantile cunning, while Roman accounts portrayed Carthage as a rival civilization defeated through military might. This perspective framed Phoenician history as subordinate to Mediterranean conquerors, influencing centuries of historiography. Classical sources, while valuable, are often colored by political and cultural bias, emphasizing conflict and framing Phoenicians primarily in terms of competition with Greece and Rome. Greek and Roman narratives highlighted aspects of Phoenician society that supported imperial agendas, including their mercantile networks, naval prowess, and diplomatic practices. While these accounts acknowledge skill and ingenuity, they often omit the structural and cultural contributions that enabled long-term maritime, economic, and urban influence. By focusing on military rivalry, conquest, and tribute, classical authors minimize the Phoenicians' role in shaping Mediterranean trade, urbanism, and cultural transmission. This selective representation influenced later perceptions, perpetuating the idea that Phoenicians were secondary actors in Mediterranean history. Material evidence provides a corrective to these textual biases. Archaeological sites across the Levant, North Africa, and the Western Mediterranean demonstrate urban complexity, maritime infrastructure, craft specialization, and religious continuity. Inscriptions, ceramics, and trade artifacts reveal systemic networks that functioned independently of military conquest. These findings underscore that Phoenician civilization achieved enduring influence through commerce, technology, and urban organization rather than empire building, challenging narratives dominated by military histories. Historiographical evaluation emphasizes the contrast between textual portrayal and archaeological reality. Classical authors often conflated the political fate of Carthage with the broader trajectory of Phoenician culture, obscuring the survival of identity and commercial networks. Modern scholarship, drawing on epigraphy, maritime archaeology, and urban studies, situates Phoenician civilization within a systemic framework, highlighting economic and cultural contributions as central to Mediterranean development. The memory of Phoenicians has therefore been shaped by a combination of classical accounts, later historical interpretation, and material evidence. Greek and Roman depictions created enduring narratives of rivalry and defeat, yet material culture demonstrates the persistence of Phoenician identity, technology, and influence. Understanding this discrepancy is critical for reconstructing an accurate historical assessment and for recognizing the structural achievements of a civilization often overshadowed by its conqueror's power does not always wear a crown. The Phoenicians exemplify how civilizations can exert lasting influence through commerce, networks, and adaptability rather than territorial conquest or centralized empire. From the Levantine coast to Western Mediterranean colonies, Phoenician city-states maintained autonomy through maritime expertise, economic specialization, and diplomatic flexibility. Their achievements in shipbuilding, trade organization, alphabetic writing, and urban planning illustrate how systemic structures, rather than militarized expansion, can shape history over centuries. Maritime networks enabled Phoenicians to transmit technology, culture, and religious practices across vast distances. Archaeological evidence shows that settlements in Iberia, North Africa, and Sicily facilitated trade while maintaining local integration, demonstrating the scalability of influence without political annexation. Commercial interdependence, coupled with strategic use of mercenary forces, allowed Phoenician city-states to survive systemic shocks and imperial pressures, illustrating the adaptive capacity of networked societies. The Phoenician alphabet and administrative practices highlight the role of knowledge in sustaining civilization. By simplifying writing for trade and governance, Phoenicians facilitated communication and record-keeping across diverse colonies, enabling economic coordination without centralized authority. These innovations spread to Greek and Roman societies, providing a foundation for literacy, bureaucracy, and cultural transmission that outlasted the political demise of Phoenician city-states. Cultural resilience is another central lesson. Despite the destruction of Carthage and incorporation into empires, Phoenician religion, art, language, and craftsmanship persisted through diaspora communities and integration into imperial systems. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence demonstrates that identity and influence can endure independently of political sovereignty, suggesting that civilizations can leave structural legacies that continue to shape society long after formal autonomy ends. The Phoenician experience illustrates the strategic advantages of economic specialization, flexible governance, and networked connectivity. Their history demonstrates that influence can be projected through systemic organization, technological expertise, and cultural dissemination rather than territorial expansion alone. Urban planning, maritime infrastructure, and trade networks served as mechanisms of continuity, highlighting the potential for civilizations to shape regional and transregional dynamics without the apparatus of empire. Ultimately, the Phoenicians provide a model of civilization in which commerce, adaptability, and networks drive historical impact. Their legacy challenges traditional notions of power defined by conquest or monarchy, showing that enduring influence often arises from systemic capacity, resilience, and innovation. This perspective encourages a broader understanding of how civilizations function, emphasizing the structural and cultural dimensions that underpin historical endurance. Phoenician history thus exemplifies how societies can exert influence over centuries through interconnected economic, technological, and cultural systems. While their political autonomy may have ended, the structural contributions of Phoenician civilization, maritime expertise, trade networks, alphabetic literacy, and urban organization continue to inform historical understanding of the Mediterranean world and demonstrate the enduring potential of non-imperial forms of power. Before we conclude this journey through Phoenician history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to receive your daily Nightfall history video. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of the Phoenician story fascinated you most? Your engagement helps us explore more civilizations in the depth and detail they deserve.